right, good.
G'day.
Yeah. Well, hello there. It's another live Grain and Grape Brewing demonstration. For those of you who are new to the show, welcome. For those of you who are regulars, welcome back. My name is Joel. And today we have yet another instalment of Ben's Style School.
We do indeed.
This is Ben.
I am.
I thought I might, this is unrehearsed, so I'm going to put you on the spot here maybe today. For those of you who are perhaps new to the show, Ben's Style School is something that you've been doing for a while now.
A few years.
Maybe I'll just ask you about that, get you to tell people what's the deal with Ben's Style School and what are your aims and goals?
That's a good question. I guess it's kind of changed since it started as well. I think for me, when I started brewing, the idea was like how wacky and wild and different and unusual could I make beer. And I was fairly successful at making a lot of wacky, wild, weird and unusual beers, but I don't know how good they were as beers. And then one day I just sort of thought, well, if I can't brew a specific style of beer in a specific way, then I'm not really kind of developing as a brewer. So I started working my way through the BJCP style guidelines and kind of trying to nail down specific styles as close as I could to the descriptions. And that kind of was really where I saw a big jump in my brewing. And I kind of thought it's a really useful thing to pursue as a brewer, to try to kind of hone your skills and hone your talent and take control of what you're making. So that's kind of where this started, was sort of thinking, well, let's look at specific styles and kind of do a deep dive into what goes into making them, how to develop a recipe, the kind of techniques involved in making them. But then because I'm a massive history nerd, it's sort of morphed into more than that as well, because there's so many interesting stories behind how various different styles came to be. So in the process of researching how to brew it, then you discover, you think, well, why do they brew it that way? And you look a little bit into it and you say, oh, okay, that's really interesting. So this is like all tied to like a tax law, or this is all tied to a battle that happened, or like there's all these like really interesting kind of backstories as to why these styles came to be. And I don't know, I find that really interesting. So I've kind of started incorporating that into the demos as well.
Oh yeah, and yeah, so you've been doing this I guess series way well before we were streaming. We're back when we used to do the live demos in store before a certain virus was around the world, but hopefully we'll be doing that again sometime soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's definitely going to be a regular series, I guess you could say, of the streams from now into the future. So for people who are interested, keep an eye out for when Ben's on, and there will be the running theme is styles. It's hard to understate the importance of styles, I think, for beginner brewers especially, and I think echoing your story, I was exactly the same, and probably it's a bit of a rite of passage. You sort of start brewing all these crazy, sort of exciting, sort of crazy recipes, and then maybe varying success. But when you start kind of getting into styles, there's a what's the word? Losing my words, but a thing, that you can follow, a regime. The word will come to me later.
Limitations can kind of unlock your creativity, and it can also sort of, if you're just going out there to brew a beer, and we've got something like 60 different types of malt here, we've got a similar amount of different hops, different yeasts. Like, where do you start? And I think the good thing about styles is it gives you some sort of parameters to work within, and the deeper you go into that sort of pursuit, the more you can kind of really focus on, well, what specific flavors am I chasing, and how can I achieve that with the ingredients I have at my disposal? And when you're brewing to style, you're kind of exercising those parts of your brain and building a library of different flavors, different smells, from using these different malts that you might not otherwise have used if you weren't like going off a recipe or going off like something that you read about. And that kind of means that if you do want to go off style or like kind of get creative and be experimental, then you've got all of that foundation to sort of build on, and as a result you end up making really amazing, wild, wacky, interesting things.
Discipline, that's the word I was looking for. Yeah, you build a discipline, and that you can apply that to all aspects of your brewing going forward. So today the style is Vienna Lager.
It is indeed. One of my favourites. I love my Germanic beers, as most of you guys will know. Particularly the amber lagers. Got a real soft spot for those beers. And I think Vienna Lager is an interesting one because it kind of has gone through 2 iterations over the course of its existence, and was all but extinct until it popped up in, of all places, Mexico. We will be touching on that a little bit today, but we probably do need to start
getting into it. Cool. Yeah, all right. Well, let's get going. I'll get out the way, and I'll leave Ben to take it from here.
Yeah. So let's get the grain in. So this is a bit of a running theme for these things. There's Vienna Lager as it exists in the current BJCP guidelines, based on the types of beers that are available in America, and the types of beers generally brewed as home brews in comps. I'll just tick that button and make it stop beeping at us. And there's the actual beer as it originally existed. Again, because I'm a bit of a history nerd, I'm going to be making a historical Vienna Lager, which is actually much easier to do than the kind of more modern examples. But I think more people are starting to kind of shift back towards this kind of more traditional style now. Or at least like doing a kind of like a hybridization of the kind of more well-known Mexican version and the classic. So I'm just pouring all the grain right in. I'll break it up once it's in there. And one of my favourite things about German beers, and I think it really sort of does go a long way into why I love them so much, is their simplicity. This beer has like 2 ingredients if you don't count water. Much like the Munich we did, much like the Pils that we're almost definitely going to do at some point, much like the Märzen that we'll also be doing at some point as well, which is kind of tied in. The Helles, the Pils, the Märzen and the Vienna are very much kind of connected in terms of the story and the characters involved in their creation. It's sort of like, it's almost the one story told through 3 or 4 different narrators.
And just for anyone interested, to your previous stream on the Munich Helles, I recommend people check that out. There's some a lot of good info in there that'll relate to what Ben is doing today. So yeah, I'll put a link somewhere for that later on for anyone who's interested. But you can find it in our YouTube archives.
But long before Vienna Lager existed, and long before like a lot of these sorts of paler, I call them paler, like nowadays we call them like amber lagers, but at the time they were the palest things in existence. Long before any of them existed, generally what would happen with German breweries is the maltster and the brewer were, if not the same person, very closely linked. So you would use one malt for a beer, and that malt would be made to the specifications for that beer. So most German beer traditionally was like a single malt beer.
Yeah, and given the kinds of equipment and processes they had at the time, there was only so light they could make the grains. Is that right? Is that why this?
Traditionally, yeah. Historically, it wasn't until the sort of 1800s before we sort of started to see pale malt become a thing, and it was the English who sort of developed those malting techniques, and we will definitely be going into that,
of course. I'm jumping ahead.
This goes along. But yeah, so historically, like if the brewer wasn't doing the malting themselves, they were working with a maltster for that brewery, and you'd get the malt made to your specs. So most German beers are single malt beers, and it all comes down to technique. And that's why I like it. I think that's also why I like Braumeisters, because they give you a lot of leeway on that technical kind of brewing.
Give you a lot of control, a lot of ease.
Yeah, I mean, you could sort of argue that you should be doing decoction mashes on all these things, and I think that's a reasonably valid argument. After doing that turbid mash at the last demo, I'm pretty confident that I could knock out a decoction in a demo. I might do one.
We'll aim for that. Yeah.
When we do the because of course I'm going to hit all of the classic German styles that I love. When we do the Malts, and we'll try to do it as a decoction.
Cool.
Because there's only so many times we can tell the story of Anton Dreyer and Gabriel Siedelmeier the second.
Yeah, sure.
But and a decoction mash might be a way to make that nice and interesting. But Braumeister, program in your temps and it'll hit them all. So as you can probably imagine, if we're making what was originally quite a pale lager, and we're only using a single malt, 3 guesses which malt that is for a Vienna Lager.
Starts with V.
It does indeed start with V. So yeah, we 100% Vienna malt. That was what the malt was created for, was this specific beer. And it took the world by storm and then disappeared off the face of the planet. Got replaced by a bunch of other beers that were more exciting or more sort of... Probably helps if I put the crossbar down. Basically it was super exciting until it wasn't. And I think part of that was just maybe not having quite as good marketing as some of the other beers that kind of copied it and ran with the theme.
Yeah.
But 100% Vienna malt. Hops that are of the European noble persuasion, which today I'm using Hallertau, partly because, and again, I do this with nearly all my beers. We sell hops in 40 and 80 gram amounts. If I'm chasing a specific bitterness to gravity ratio, or I'm chasing a specific kind of profile or bitterness level, I'll look at the hops that fit the style, and whichever one has the alpha acid which gets me closest to full bags of hops, I'll use that. And I might put them in at slightly different minute marks to kind of dial in the numbers and stuff, but it's just a way that you're using what you're buying. You're not leaving it kicking around in a freezer or in other places to kind of lose its oomph.
Good trick.
So I'm going with Hallertau because it's 6.6% alpha, which means that I needed 33 grams in the boil, which is close to 40. The other hops I was going to have to open an 80 gram bag and use like 50 grams or whatever. Nah.
Yeah, so that's a good trick for anyone who's designing recipes out there. You can use that your available ingredients as a means of choosing a particular ingredient over another.
And part of that as well comes down to, like we were saying earlier, getting to know different ingredients and what they're doing, and understanding the style and what the requirements are. And like if you've got those two kind of data points, I think when you're getting started, you've got a recipe, and if we don't, like, if you can't get access to a specific grain or a specific hop that's listed in that recipe, it seems like I'm not going to be able to brew this beer. But so many of these things are interchangeable, and so many of them, it'll be a different beer, but it won't necessarily be a bad change.
Totally.
So with like a kind of German, Austrian, Hungarian kind of chunk of the world style beer, you can generally use any of the sort of noble hops like your Sars, your Hallertau, your Tettnang, your Spaltz, even Pearl would work in a lot of cases, and the beer's not going to suffer from it.
Yeah.
It'll be a different character, but it'll be an appropriate character.
Yeah. But don't go chucking American Cascade or...
unless you know exactly what you're doing.
Yeah, unless you're doing it for a reason.
Like, if you're like this, I know exactly what this hop is like, and I think I can achieve X by using it in this context, then you might come up with something amazing. I think Belgian beers are great for that sort of experimentation, because they would literally use whatever they had handy and weren't picky at all. So if that was Cascade hops, I'd use Cascade hops. And I think we were even talking about English IPAs recently, and a lot of the breweries literally using American, like fruity American hops in a lot of those earlier examples, because they had access to them. So why wouldn't you? Higher alpha than the ones that they could get locally, so they could use less of them and get the same impacts. So yeah, it's not as kind of dire as a lot of folk when they're getting started think. If you can't get a specific
when you especially in hop, because if you group hops, you got your New World hops and then noble European hops. If you group them in those sorts of categories, then you've got a lot of leeway within that.
Yeah. And it can be a good thing too. Like, I mean, I've got certain recipes which I brew fairly regularly, like particularly German ones, like my Märzen, my Helles, my Vienna, my Pils. And I like to switch up the hops in them.
Yeah.
Because it kind of gives... You're making the same beer, and as long as your technique is on point, and you're kind of hitting the numbers you need to hit in terms of your bitterness, in terms of your ratios, in terms of like your gravities, pH, all those things. It's still going to be the same beer, but with slight variations in terms of the character that you're getting from the hops and things. And I think that's kind of a good way to keep mixing it up and keep it fresh and make you want to keep brewing those beers and keep drinking them.
And just tweaking that one variable can give you a really good idea of what that particular ingredient tastes like. So a Hallertau versus a Sars.
Yeah.
If you're the same grain bill and you brewed your beer exactly the same way and you just change those two hops, you'll get an appreciation or an idea of what those two hops bring to the beer.
I also think practicing just tweaking one variable is a really valuable learning thing as well. Like trying to be as in control of the brew as you possibly can, and being aware of what those other variables are and how you can limit changing them as much as possible. I mean, again, something like this helps a lot.
Yep.
Because this takes a lot of the variables out of the equation, like temperatures, times, through your mash. But definitely like things like gravity, which we've touched on in a few streams. So calculating your dilution levels needed to hit your exact gravities that you want to hit, and then using those numbers to like shift your bitterness, like your amount of hops to like get your bitterness dialed in. Like all those little things are really sort of good things to practice in terms of nailing down consistency and becoming a better brewer, basically. So let's talk a bit about the mash today. So I have doughed in at 40 degrees. I like to do that with German beers. I like to do that with all beers, actually. It's kind of a fun, different way to mash.
Yeah, I kind of started doing it too in my beers.
It helps to loosen up I'm just going to crank this up a little. It helps to loosen up the mash. If you give it a brief little rest down around that 35 to 40 mark. That's where your sort of beta glucanase hangs out. It also helps to hydrate the grains fully before it sort of starts to get into your saccharification zones, your starch converting kind of zones. And what I like most about it, and I was just talking to Joel about this before we hit play, or whatever the equivalent is, before we hit go, record.
Yeah, something like that.
Is that you can take as much time as you want to mash in at 40. Like, you're not really sort of got any big changes happening in there. So getting the grains in there, mixing them all through, making sure that they're properly hydrated and everything before you kind of hit start on your stopwatch or you set your alarm or do any of those things you're doing for your mash. Oh, I've got the hiccups, that's convenient. You're not kind of getting starch conversion happening. You're not really getting like proteins degraded. You're not getting any of those things happening. So you can kind of take the time to make sure you've got no dough balls, that everything's kind of good to go, and then start adding heat and bringing it up to your kind of mashing temps. So that's what I'm doing today.
Think of it as like a pre-mash or something like that, like a conditioning mash.
Yeah, and I think in German beers, and again with the Brewmaster it's really easy, I'll often do a protein rest. So I'll do a 40 degree dough into a protein rest, into a beta amylase, into an alpha amylase, into a mash out. So like a 5-step mash. I'm not doing that today.
Okay.
Just something different.
And
I was going to, and then when I was on the Brewmaster looking through the recipes to find my kind of standard German mashing regime, I saw one on there and it interested me, so I thought I'd just run with that today. So I'm basically just doing a 0-minute rest at 40. So dough in at 40 and then ramp it straight up to 61 to do the beta amylase rest. Yeah. And what that's going to do is, as that's ramping up, it's going to go through all of those temperature zones for those other enzymes. So it's going to spend a little bit of time at 40 degrees, at 45, at 50, at 55, until it hits 60 for the main beta rest.
Yeah, so we'll be doing something a little bit as it goes through those.
Yeah, and that's actually how I used to, when I was brewing Brew in a Bag when I first got started, and I say when I first got started, I did it for years. When I sort of started brewing German beers on my Brew in a Bag rig, that was how I'd do it. I would literally dough in at 35 or 40 and then keep stirring because I didn't have a nice recirculating pump like the Brewmaster does, and just keep adding heat and get it up to my sort of 60 degree initial mash. And my beers came out really good doing it that way. So I think it's a cool way of sort of fudging the classic German mash. And if you don't have a nice programmable unit, it's really easy to achieve with whatever system you do have, whether you're doing like a even like a mash tun, like an Esky mash tun. You start with a thick mash, similar like we did with the turban mash. If you start with like slightly thicker mash, dough in at 40, and then pour in enough hot water to get you up to 60, and then you can pour in enough hot water to get you up to 70, and then sparge it through and do it that way as well. It's a good way that you can, again, approximate what you'd be getting in a sort of German
4-man step mash. And
almost like a Hotchkiss sort of thing.
Just to recap, you mentioned a protein rest that happens around the mid-50s, is that right?
Yeah, so there's 2 different protein enzymes which folk tends to target. Protease and lipidase, I think, are the 2. Protease is definitely one of them. I'm not 100% sure on the other one, so I apologise if there's any biologists or chemists or anyone in chat. If there are, drop a comment and tell me why I'm wrong, because I want to learn. But basically, the higher temperature for the protein rest, so around the kind of 55 to 60 mark. Even though that is still in the zone for beta amylase, it's generally better for your beer to target that range if you're going to do a protein rest. If you target the lower range, which is your sort of your 45 to 55 sort of range, it can get a little insipid and take a bit of character from the beer.
From the beer and body as well, is that the risk? It can make it a bit thin because the proteins in that, they're being broken down at that range is basically the general.
It's breaking down the proteins you don't necessarily want to be broken down.
Yeah, you want to keep those, but it can help with clarity, and there's a few reasons why you would, but I guess we're going into the weeds there a bit, but today you're not doing that.
No, we're not. Well, I mean, we'll be passing through there, but it'll be like passing through a lot of different areas. We're not spending any considerable length of time.
It won't be sitting there.
But there's actually a really good paper which I have saved on the computers here somewhere, which I might try to find and see if we can link to it or something in the Facebook description or on the YouTube description or something like that. I'll see if I can find it, but it talks specifically about a lot of these different enzymes and these different rests and
probably it's a good,
why you do them.
There's charts out there. I just thought it's probably good to sort of talk about reinforce the different temperatures and why they're useful just as we go.
And honestly,
for those of you who are new to all this,
honestly, with this beer, with this grain bill, probably get away with just doing. Even if we just did a 60 and a 70, you'd still get a pretty close approximation to like a German kind of character or an Austrian kind of character. The thing is though, because we're working with base malt, which is slightly less enzymatic and like powerful at conversion, these extra steps do help a lot. So when we hit the demo, it's actually critical that you do a protein rest with that grain, because if you don't, you're not going to get conversion.
Okay, so
you'll get significantly less fermentability in your wort. You'll hit your gravity, but it won't be as fermentable, and you won't be able to attenuate it down to where you want it to be. So it's really critical to hit those extra steps with the Munich. With the Vienna, it's a little bit different, and I will be talking about how Vienna is malted a little bit today. Okay. Again, I'm not a maltster, so it won't be perfect. And if there are any maltsters watching, again, please comment. Yeah. I know there's an amazing PhD doctor down in Tassie who we got out for the last ANHC conference which we ran. Dr. Evan Evans, and that person probably knows more about malt than just about anyone else on the face of the planet, and came into the shop and had a really good yarn with them about different types of malt and grains and things like that. So if you want to learn about malt, you can Google Evan Evans or the malt doctor, as they're I think sometimes referred to, and definitely learn a lot of pretty interesting info about that. But
whole other aspect of the hobby,
I think there's 4 ingredients, so if you're going to specialise in one of them, you can go pretty deep.
You can in each of them,
but basically the way that Vienna is malted makes it a little bit more able to be used as the sole grain.
It's a little darker than Pilsner malt.
Yeah.
Not as dark as Munich, is that right?
Not. It can be. They can kind of overlap.
Range.
So Munich is generally darker, but there is a slight overlap in the colour range. But there's more going on with the way that they're malted. So they're definitely different beers. So you can kind of use them interchangeably. So like if you have a recipe that calls for Vienna malt and your local homebrew shop doesn't have any stock of Vienna, but they have stock of a light Munich, which is the same colour range. And I'm pretty sure our Australian Vienna and Munich malts are the same colour.
Yeah, okay.
You can swap like for like,
Yep.
but it will be a different character.
It'll be different, but yeah, okay.
It'll be different, but it'll work.
Yep.
And interestingly, a lot of recipes I've found for Vienna Lagers, some of them don't even have Vienna malt in them. They're like a combination of Pilsner,
right.
Munich, and some other different things that people have thrown in there. And that's not saying that they're bad recipes or bad beers. They've just achieved the same kind of character, taking a different path to get there. Which, you know, why not?
Yeah.
Munich has more of a intense depth to it and richness than Vienna does. So maybe they wanted a little bit more of that depth, but they wanted to dial it back, so they threw the Pilsner in there, which is a little bit drier and lighter and sweeter than the Vienna.
Yep.
So they've kind of balanced it out that way and achieved a sort of similar thing, but with slightly different characteristics. So, you know, you can absolutely, and again, comes down to playing with these ingredients and getting your head around what they do and how they interact, but you can approximate stuff in interesting ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that pretty much covers the mash. It might even be a quick stream today. We'll see how we go.
Okay.
But it's
sure.
You know, but basically, that's the thing with German beers. One malt, one hop.
Yeah.
Simple water.
Very, very simple recipes. It's all about technique, as you were saying. Just to repeat what you were saying, these are really good beers to test yourself on.
Yeah, especially your fermentation. Nailing your fermentation with your lagers is really where the beer is made. Plenty of yeast, really healthy, lots of oxygen, lots of nutrient in the wort, and really sort of taking an active role in the fermentation, not just kind of set and forget.
Yep, sure.
Monitoring, it's doing sensory analysis as well, smelling, tasting, seeing if you need to change your approach. So like halfway through, you might be getting heaps of diacetyls, like I might need to bump up the temperature a little bit to blow this off, or you might be getting like different smells and flavors coming through. And
really,
and just you might have hit your terminal gravity or what you thought was your terminal gravity, but there's like a really strong green apple character. So like, what can we do about that?
Yes.
There's all these different sort of things that you are kind of engaging with and being on top of, which makes it fun.
Yeah, and lagers are one of those styles that you, to do them properly, you need some kind of fermentation temperature control, like a fridge with a thermostat, or some other, some of the newer units that are out, the glycol chillers or the brew jackets.
Or a nice cave.
Or a cave if you happen to be in Germany, or I don't know where, Buckham, is that a place in Victoria where the caves are?
You should brew all your lagers in Buchan.
Yeah.
Which honestly, they could use the tourism as well. They're still bouncing back from last summer, so.
Oh, okay, they had fires out there as well, of course, like probably a lot of places really, unfortunately. But
this just became a go to Buchan stream.
Yeah, go to Buchan.
Go to Buchan.
Do yourself a favour, go to Buchan.
Jeff will be happy with that.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, pop in and see
Jeff. Used to do a lot of caving back in the day.
Of course, yes, yeah.
So this is going to do a thing now and mash. We've got two different steps, 61 degrees, 71 degrees.
Okay.
61 degrees is your beta amylase rest. That's where your sort of the really simple sugars are going to come through. And then your 71 degrees, your alpha amylase rest, which is going to be slightly more complex and more characterful, longer chain
Leaving
sugars.
some body behind in the beer, in theory.
Yeah, but we're still going to, we've put some, I'll talk about the salts and the water treatment as well in a bit, but we have put some calcium in the water, so that's going to help protect the beta amylase. So it'll still be kind of functioning for a while once we move up into that 70 degree mark. It won't instantly denature and become ineffective. Let's talk about Vienna malt. I'm trying to think of like the order to approach things. I think talking about the malt itself is probably the first thing to go with.
Yeah,
and then we can move into like the history of. Or maybe we should do the history of how the malt was developed and then go into specifically how they make it.
I don't
Chat? Any ideas?
Who wants to go first? Stuart, I'll just chime in. He's just left a comment. He's got a heap of old mine shafts around his country block. Maybe you can ferment beers in an old mine.
Yeah, get your fermenters down there, laughing. Perfect. Well, okay, so let's do the Gabriel Siedelmeier and Anton Dreher thing again.
Yeah, why not?
The two most important dudes in my life, probably, or two of.
Screw you, Dad.
I can't think of any two German people who I consider more important. Well, that's not true. So basically, Vienna is all about Anton Dreher. There's two brewers who basically introduced pale malt to Europe, which is Gabriel Siedelmeier II and Anton Dreher. Anton Dreher, they both inherited breweries from their dads, basically. Gabriel Siedelmeier II inherited the Spartan Brewery in Bavaria from his dad. And Anton Dreher had inherited a brewery whose name escapes me annoyingly in Austria. Considering we're doing the Vienna Lager stream.
Something Groll?
Hey?
Groll? Someone Groll? Is that? Groll, the name you're thinking of.
The brewery?
Yeah, the guy. Oh, the brewery, sorry. No, as it were.
It's great that I can remember the one that's relevant for the Munich Lager, but not the Vienna one on the Vienna stream. So basically, Anton Dreher inherited the brewery from his dad when his dad died, but he was quite young when his dad died. He wasn't ready to take over the running of the business, so it kind of got taken over by sort of the brewers that worked there, and like there was a period, like an interim period of sort of caretaking. And then as he got a little bit older, like kind of 16, 17, he's like, right, I'm going to go off and do an apprenticeship. I'm going to go around Europe, go to all these different breweries and learn as much as I can from all the different brewers so that I can bring that knowledge back with me and know what I'm doing, like have kind of done the work to become a great brewer so that I can lead this brewery into awesome things. Mm-hmm. This almost exactly mirrors what happened with Gabriel Siedelmeier II, who also inherited the brewery, was also quite young. His dad hadn't died yet, I don't think, but he knew that he was like that this brewery was going to go to him one day, and he wanted to similarly like level up his knowledge, level up his skills, do his sort of apprenticeship so that when that day came, he'd be ready. So both of those guys coincidentally were doing the same thing at about the same age at about the same time, and at one point their paths kind of crossed, and they realised that they were both kind of on the same journey of beer discovery, I guess, and decided to kind of team up. Formed a great friendship, you know, two young guys about the same age from roughly the same part of Europe running around learning about beer, and they probably got up to all sorts of crazy shenanigans on that trip as well. But one thing in particular that really hit both of them was in England. So up to that point, malting, the kilning process of creating malt involved open fires or some kind of like direct heat source, which would result in darkening of the malt. It would result often in smokiness and roasty flavours. And that was just considered an inescapable part of kilning.
That was part of the beers back then. That was,
in England, they had developed a technique involving hot air to kiln the malt, which allowed them to basically make malt that was a lot paler than the malt that had previously been getting made in different parts of the world. And we touched on that a little bit as well, I think, in the IPA, IPA thing.
And the Munich as well.
And in the Munich Helles. So because basically, like your British Pale Ale was like the first pale, amazing beer, and
would have been revolutionary at the time.
It was absolutely insane. And interestingly, what led to glasses being used in pubs, because people wanted to see this amazing pale beer, like rather than
Yes.
these like brown murky things which everyone used their pewter or wooden mugs for. You had this incredible pale beer that everyone wanted to see, so they started using glass instead of pewter and things in pubs. And yeah, both these guys were really taken with it. They thought it was amazing. They wanted to, they saw the potential for greatness in bringing that back to Europe and incorporating that into their respective breweries. So they really kind of focused hard on what those guys in England were doing. They apparently allegedly stole yeast samples, wort samples, and various other things from these different English breweries so that they could analyse it and really sort of study it.
Yeah.
And they took that knowledge back with them to their respective hometowns and home breweries. Now, this is where, and I don't think I've touched this part of the story before in any of my demos, but this is kind of where Vienna Lager comes in, because you've got the three main European, like German malts, like the three big malts, which is your Pilsner malt, your Vienna malt, and your Munich malt, named after the cities that they were kind of developed in. And also like were kind of the sole malts incorporated in the respective styles that were sort of brewed from them. And again, this is all happening in the 1800s, relatively recent. Now, Vienna malt was actually the first.
Okay.
And Vienna Lager was the first pale lager.
Right. Okay.
So not a lot of people realise that. So
everyone sort of thinks, Pilsner, don't they, as being...
Yeah, everyone kind of knows like Pilsner, and then like I guess Munich Helles came out of Pilsner, and they kind of knew there was Märzen going on, and Vienna was in there somewhere. Most people accept that Vienna lagers and Märzens are really similar and were kind of happening around the same time. Most folk sort of know the story of those two guys running around stealing wort and doing what they did, but basically Anton Dreher developed Vienna malt. He went back and like experimented with the kilning, with the local barley, with different sort of processes, and created Vienna malt. Mm-hmm. And then he used that malt to create, because the bottom fermenting lager yeasts, I hate that term bottom fermenting, but I'm going from the historical stuff that I've read. The sort of fancy German lager yeasts were all the rage at the time. He's like, well, of course I'm going to use this lager yeast to ferment this beer. And so, yeah, he fermented 100% Vienna malt with his lager yeast, and the resulting beer was this insanely pale, bright, delicious, malty, clear beer that everyone went wild over.
Yeah.
Now, Gabriel Siedelmeier, a little bit later than that, did the same thing, but he took his a little bit darker, had a slightly different process involved, but it was still the same concept of like using the hot air to kiln, and he called his obviously Munich malt, because Munich,
he was from Munich.
Versus Vienna, he wouldn't have called it Vienna malt. But interestingly, the beer that he made, so the Vienna Lager was also called a Märzen, because it was brewed in March and then stored in the caves, like lagered and then served. So Gabriel Siedelmeier, there's records which suggest that his earlier beers that he did were called Märzen brewed in the Vienna style.
Okay. Or
in the style of Vienna Lager. So he was kind of like giving a nod to Anton Dreher's beers that he'd been making, like, and it was like, because it'd become quite popular, and he was like, hey guys, here's like a Munich version, like made in that style, but with my Munich malt. And was kind of marketing it as like, this is like the Munich version of that Vienna Lager that you all love so much. So it's really kind of wild to think about that, that Märzen was initially like one of the names used to refer to Vienna Lager, not the Munich version, and also that the early Munich lagers were literally named after the Vienna lagers that had sort of come before it. because it does tend to get like second fiddle to like your Oktoberfest beers and to all these different things. Like Vienna lagers aren't like the big kind of well-known sought after kind of one of the three. It's sort of similar to pasta, you know, like everyone, like the Roman pastas, everyone knows carbonara, and not as many people are into the cacio e pepe or the, you know, like.
Sure.
It's,
You got
the Vienna. The Vienna's like the kind of the runt of the litter, like the less kind of celebrated. But it was the first, and even before Pilsner as well. So like Pilsner beers were absolutely inspired by the Vienna Lager.
Without Vienna Lager.
But they just took it even further with the pale kilning.
Yeah, they just pushed
the soft water of Pilsen and the spicy SARS hops and all those things just kind of
worked together.
Came together into this like incredible beer. But
these styles of beer, the Pilsner, Vienna Lager, and Metz, and they also raised some hackles as well at the time.
Sorry,
is that true? You know, there was some pushback from the traditional brewers at the time who had their own styles, and then these came in, and
particularly in Bavaria. Bavaria is sort of known for their dark beers, and a lot of the more conservative brewers were like pretty upset at the idea of bringing these pale abominations into the thing, and effectively promoting these rival beers from Czechoslovakia, which wasn't Czechoslovakia at the time, it was Bohemia, but
at the time.
Europe never stays any one thing for any period of time. I think historically, like, countries change, borders shift.
Names change. So I guess you could say Siedelmeier and Dreyer were sort of the disruptors of their day in the beer world.
There were these young upstarts who went off on a journey of self-discovery and came back and revolutionized the world of beer. And that's why I sort of say that they're, you know, the third and fourth most important German people to ever exist in the 1800s. So it's
among the nicest.
Yeah. So yeah, really amazing stuff. But yeah, for whatever reason, Vienna Lager was massive for 50, 60 years and then just disappeared. No one was brewing it anymore.
Yeah, not as
I guess there was a few sort of things historically that happened, but particularly like, you know, a couple of world wars, some revolutions throughout the kind of Austro-Hungarian Empire. Lots of tumultuousness from 1850 to 1940, really. A lot of stuff happened in Europe. And yeah, for whatever reason, like the other styles carried through and Vienna Lager just didn't. I think the excitement of Pilsner probably added a lot to that. Because the Munich is a little bit richer, a little bit darker. It kind of could carve its own niche out. The Pilsner is like quite different. Pale and dry, and the Vienna was probably closer to the Pils, or bang in the middle, I guess. But I guess like it
just wasn't,
because it was sort of sitting in that in between thing. It was neither one of those other two exciting things, and I guess maybe it lost a bit of
enough on its own to capture longevity.
Yeah, a bit of its rock star status. So it kind of disappeared as a style. But interestingly, there was some unrest in Mexico in the late 1800s, early 1900s as well. And at the time, Napoleon III, I believe it was at that time, wanted to go in and make sure to sort of establish French dominance and French rule in those colonies. So he sort of sent some crew down there, some Austrian crew, because Austria was under the Napoleonic Empire at that time. And they went in there and tried to retake Mexico and establish the sort of the colonial outpost, and failed miserably. But a lot of the sort of colonizers that went there were brewers. So all of a sudden in Mexico you have all these Austrian brewers living there, wanting to make their beers, and so they did. And those traditions kind of carried through. And most modern Mexican beer kind of comes from that Austrian brewing tradition. So you pay your Coronas and your Dos Equis and like all those things come from like your paler sort of Viennese lagers. And then you've got beers like your Negro Modelo. So Modelo is a brewery. Negro is like the dark beer that they do.
Yep. It's quite malty too.
It is very malty.
Coming from a hot climate, it's
that kind of effectively kept the style alive.
Yeah.
But reinvented and reimagined for like the Mexican sort of paradigm, which most Americans for a long time would associate Vienna Lager with those Mexican kind of iterations of it.
Yeah.
But I mean, one thing that happened, which is probably understandable in the Americas, is that more and more corn started to be used as adjuncts in the beers, and things like caramel malts and roasted malts were added. I think there's a lot of America has very hard water, very carbonate water, so having roasted adjuncts and things would help to offset that, to acidify the wort and those kinds of things. Like with so many of these kind of things, you know, like the tropical stout in Jamaica, where you had like getting barley to Jamaica was a massive ordeal, or to Sri Lanka as well. So rather than using all this super expensive and hard to get barley, they started to substitute some of the mash with like molasses, which the local sugarcane production created a lot of molasses as a byproduct, so they were putting that into their beers. And it's the same sort of thing.
Yeah,
like
so
you use what you've got at your disposal.
More examples, exactly. They have.
You adapt your practices to the water that you've got handy.
Yep.
You do what you need to do to kind of
to make it work.
To make what you want to make.
And that's how styles are born. Yeah.
So modern Vienna Lager generally is kind of viewed as Negro Modelo being like the kind of the benchmark beer, like the kind of the beer that everyone knows, that's really sort of ubiquitous with the style and
widely available,
widely distributed,
easy to get.
So that if you're trying to explain what a Mexican style Vienna Lager, or just until fairly recently just a Vienna Lager was to somebody, you just say, oh, you know, Negro Modelo, you can get it at Taco Bell or Taco Bill or whatever. Like, so yeah, I know that beer.
And that modern Mexican interpretation is darker than what, generally speaking, I guess there would have been dark versions back in historically.
Considerably darker.
Quite, okay.
And I think part of that was just like I said, I think the water in a lot of the Americas is very high in carbonate, which would have a strong alkaline buffering to the water.
Yep.
Similar to like stout in Ireland.
Yes, okay. Because of the water's hard.
Very hard, very carbonate water. Using a decent chunk of roasted grains helps to acidify the mash and bring the pH back down to where it needs to be.
Yep.
Would have been probably, I'm guessing, a similar kind of story where using some crystal malts and some roasted malts would have helped to ameliorate the effects of that carbonate water and get the beers where they needed to be.
So for anyone interested in trying them, a traditional, a true traditional Vienna Lager, maybe harder to find on a wide scale. You know, your local craft brewery or brew pub. Like, these are the places that tend to, I guess, to release them these days. You know, if they're more interested in doing a one-off sort of nod to the style. But generally, it's unless you're in Vienna, I guess.
I don't even know if there's Viennese brewers making them even as like a nod to the history. I think there might be one or two, but it's like I said, the style pretty much became extinct except for those Mexican iterations of it. So I think really there are definitely a few craft brewers that are making more traditional Vienna lagers now, but I can't think of any locally.
So sure. So if you see one on tap there somewhere, try it, or
make it. This is what I love about home brewing, and this is, I think, what a few of my style schools have dealt specifically with extinct styles for this reason, because you can recreate these beers from history that you just can't go and buy. And you can, you know, when you're drinking a beer that hasn't been brewed in 100 years, there's something special about that. You don't know if you got it right.
Yeah.
but at least you kind of, you know, and again, like, as another instance where brewing to style and brewing to a kind of, to a brief really helps with achieving that. So like if you're getting lots of practice, like trying to nail different like stylistic parameters and trying to nail specific flavor profiles based on recipes or based on like what you've learned about a style of beer, then if you find like a historic style that's gone out of production, that's become extinct, you can look at like the records around it, you can look at some different recipes, and then if you've got that practice in, you stand a much better chance of accurately recreating it from the information you've got.
Make some educated guesses and infer what they were intending at the time.
But I mean, this isn't one of those beers. Like this is a style of beer that we know exactly how to make.
Yeah,
like,
yeah. I think I would say so.
It's like, you know, Vienna Malt and some noble hops.
Yeah,
it's not too hard to kind of figure out.
So
but it's really, really delicious. It's one of my favorite styles. And just using Vienna Malt as your entire malt bill generally is an awesome thing. Like most of you guys will probably be familiar with Jeff's forays into the world of Vienna.
He's
doing his Vienna IPAs, Vienna Pale Ales, like lots of really hoppy, delicious beers just using Vienna Malt, because you get a toastiness and a malt complexity without any cloyingness or sweetness or caramel kind of flavors which mask the hops. So it's a really, like, not just for like making like a lager, which is awesome, that's my kind of wheelhouse, but as a base for like other types of beers as well, it gives
ales and stuff.
It gives a depth and complexity that just using a base, like a standard base malt, like a Pilsner or an ale malt, doesn't give you. And that's, it's just good. Just do it. Just crack. It's one of those beers where I think having it on tap is just good. Like, you always feel like it. It's one of those beers where you're thirsty, you pour it. You want some like rich malty flavour, you pour it. If you know, it kind of ticks a lot of boxes.
And there's a story behind it too. You can tell people, look, this beer hasn't been available commercially for over 100 years, and I've got it on tap in my house. Try it.
Yeah. Although I think now you can.
Well, I mean,
probably not around here.
Aside from the craft breweries.
What I found interesting, I went to New Zealand a few years ago, and they have. I was only on the North Island, but they have like 3 or 4 different kind of chunks of the North Island that have a different kind of pub beer. So like in Australia, obviously, like New South Wales, it's like Tui's New. Victoria is Carlton Draft. South Australia, I think, is, I don't know, South Australia.
Yeah. Good
Coopers,
question. Maybe if anyone's from South Australia helps out, what's the
standard kind of mass-produced pub beer? Queensland has like 4X. You know, there's like your kind of
Coopers. Coopers South Australia.
Yeah, Coopers is there. I think they've got a big one as well. They've got the Coopers and then they've got the big one.
Not a lager.
But anyway, like each state kind of has its pub beer, and in New Zealand, like in the North Island at least, there was kind of like 3. Like it's almost like the North Island was split into 3 little chunks, and depending on where you were, like they had their pub beer. And in the middle of the North Island, which is where we were spending a lot of time around Lake Taupo, it was now I can't remember. That sucks.
I wish I could.
Can't remember the name of it. But whichever one is in, it was draft. It was something draft in the middle kind of chunk of the North Island, and it was an amber lager.
Okay.
And that's their sort of pub beer, and it was really nice. It was, you know, it was a mass-produced like kind of macro lager, so it had the kind of what you would expect from that type of beer. But because it was an amber lager instead of just like your standard like as pale as possible kind of yellowy things, which I think there's a place for as well.
Sure.
It just added a little bit of extra
character.
something to it, and it was the place where we were staying had a bar nearby that we went to on the first night, and they had a couple of local craft beers, and then it was just the standard fare. So of course I went for the craft beers first. The first one I had was horrible, terribly infected and just disgusting. Everyone was laughing at me when I ordered it.
Oh, really? How are you to know?
Well, it wasn't even that. They were just like talking about how like craft beer is like terrible.
Oh,
and
okay.
all these people
It was
like,
that sort of
blah,
situation.
blah, blah, blah. And
Yeah.
so I'm like, I jumped to the defense of good beer, and I ordered the local craft, and then I drank it, and they're like, hey, how is it? I'm like, oh, it's really bad. And they all laughed at me. So I was like, I don't care. I don't live here. And yeah, and then I had one of those drafts, and it was great. So there were a few times, like literally 3, I think, that I had one, because there was so many amazing breweries and so much amazing beer to drink over there that it would have been crazy if I was just drinking that the whole time. But yeah, if you're watching this, Carlton United, chuck a Vienna into your
In the lineup. Yeah.
into your lineup and get it into all those sports bars and pokies bars, because everyone drank it.
Yeah.
Everyone drank it.
Yeah, right.
I think that was all I had to say about Vienna Lager's sort of direction. So let's sort of talk a little bit about the malt itself and how it's created. Do we need to do any camera things?
Yep, batteries are holding up. We'll maybe need to take a break eventually. But actually what I will do is say, just as a final note, on your little, I did knock up a package, video package of your, during your, not Munich stream, the, what was the
IPA?
No, before that, the other lager.
The Helles.
Helles, thank you. My brain is on fire today. Ben did a really good rundown, again, of that recap of that story about how the pale lagers were created. So I'll be releasing that on YouTube at some point in the future. So keep an eye out for that. For those of you who haven't subscribed, hit the subscribe button, and when that comes out, I just put some graphics and stuff on there. It's a really good little story of how all that came to be.
Nice.
So keep an eye out for that.
So how do we make Vienna malt? I mean, how do we make Pilsner malt? How do we make any malt? There's a process involved. Actually, before we get into that, I should touch briefly on the water, because I haven't done that yet today.
Oh, yes.
I know that folks like to get all the info. So this is Altona water. I plugged the numbers from City West Water into the brewersfriend.com water calculator. We're not affiliated, they don't sponsor us. If they want to, happily take a sponsorship, but I'll wear your shirt around with pride. But it's a really good water calculator that I'd like to use, and I put into my water 3 grams of calcium sulfate and 2 grams of calcium chloride. We have a much higher chloride percentage in Altona water than we do sulfate, so I just sort of balance that out a little bit to get pretty much a balanced profile in terms of chloride to sulfate ratios. And I wanted to bump up the calcium to sort of a respectable level. So again, pretty much if you stick for balanced, or if you're going to tip it in a direction, for this one, I'd say tip it towards the drier.
Okay.
But ideally, I think you're better off going with a balanced profile and getting that dryness through your bitterness with this style, because you do want a lot of that malt to be there and present and kind of balancing. So balanced water profile, I have put in a few mils of lactic acid as well, just to knock the pH down, because we're only using Vienna malt. We don't have any dark malts or crystal malts to knock the pH down. So normally what I do is chuck in some acidulated malt. That's the kind of the German way. But I kind of rushed it this morning. I've had a really flat out week. So I kind of knocked out all the water chemistry this morning before we started streaming, and I just syringe lactic acid, squirted in a few mils based on my calculations. And that should have us sitting at about 5.3 pH.
Yep.
You can go as low easily as 5.1 with any German, Austrian, Czech style of beer. A lower pH isn't a bad thing. Particularly Bavarian beers, a lower pH can be quite a good thing. But 5.3 is kind of where you want to be for 99.99% of beers. So I just, again, rushing through the water chemistry this morning, said 5.3, sweet, 3 mils, squirted it in. Away we go. So that's the water. Your results may vary.
Depending on your water source. Yep.
Yeah. So if you can get a water report for your tap water, if you're in the western suburbs of Melbourne, you can do that very easily by visiting City West Water.
Lucky.
And they have a by-suburb breakdown of all the different things that are in your water.
Yeah, unfortunately.
You can take all those different things and you can input them into a calculator. There's Brewing Water, it's brewersfriend.com. The new version of Beersmith has a decent water calculator in it. I haven't started using it yet. But I intend to start using it soon, just so I can kind of calibrate to it. Because I think with all the different calculators you use, like any sort of things that you're regularly kind of, is that my, no, that is cool, we're good. Any calculators that you're using, it doesn't matter how accurate they are, it just matters that you use it every time.
Consistently, yep.
Consistency is the key. So if you're using the same calculator for each brew, then you've calibrated your kind of idea of what these things mean. So,
yeah. And then you can make adjustments going on taste. If it's hasn't met your expectations, you can.
When you're doing recipe design, recipe development, you're in your head trying to balance out bitterness with sweetness, with richness, with all these different things. And the numbers kind of give you some, like a rough idea of where you're at with those things. So my idea of 35 IBUs is based on Beersmith's idea of 35 IBUs. If you tested my beer that I asserted was 35 IBUs and with like a photo spectrometer or something and found out that it was actually 43 IBUs, then that doesn't matter because in my head that's what 35 IBUs is. And when I'm creating a recipe and like throwing grains and things like that in there, and I'm thinking in my head I want it to be about this bitter, and in my brain 35 IBUs is about that bitter. That's what I'm going to do.
And you're making adjustments to the salts and the grains can alter how it's perceived in the final beer.
Yeah.
Not necessarily what the numbers might come from some computer or a lab somewhere.
Yeah. Numbers are important, but they're not.
You may.
They're not as kind of. What's the word I'm looking for? How am I trying to say
it's something to work off.
The precision of the accuracy of your numbers isn't as important as the consistency of your perception of the numbers.
Sure.
Like there's certain things that you can measure that you'll absolutely be right. Like your gravity, you should always measure and you should always like dial that in. And if you're shooting for a certain bitterness level, like in IBUs. We've spoken a bit about IBUs before. So IBUs is a measurement of the amount of isomerized alpha acids dissolved within a set amount, like a set volume of liquid. So if you're shooting for a specific IBU target, you can calculate your gravity, you can calculate the volume you're going to need to hit that gravity. And then if you know that volume, then you can calculate the amount of hops needed and how long to boil them for to hit the IBU number that you have in your head based on the software that you're using. So that IBU number may not be completely accurate because it's a lot harder to measure accurately. But if your brain is calibrated to that bitterness level and the numbers that you can measure accurately are taken into account and worked, like built towards, then you'll be able to consistently achieve what you're shooting for. That's what I'm trying to say. It's a really long-winded and a roundabout way of saying it, but
and I think,
measure what you can.
Yeah.
And
don't. Expect to dial in a degree of dialing in, and that includes, your brain to your tongue. The reference to what's on paper. Yeah. I was going to say, for those of us who in the northern suburbs, our water reports tend to be a little lackluster. So if anyone, I don't know, this pops up on the forums, sometimes you've got to do a little bit of detective work or inferring, and that's okay. That's just how it is. Close enough is often good enough. Yeah. In these sorts of situations.
I've heard of people taking samples of their tap water to pool shops for testing.
Okay. So I guess they can test pH.
pH and I think they can test like the amounts of different things as well.
They can. Oh.
I don't know exactly how deep they can go with it, but I've definitely heard of people doing it. In the middle of summer might not be the best time to do that. They're probably flat out. But if you go to a pool shop in the middle of winter, when they're probably not doing too many tests, that might be a good time to do it.
Yep. And the makeup of your water can change throughout the year too, just for, again, anyone taking notes, depending on what reservoir or what treatment facility they divert the water through at different times of the year, that can alter,
Which again, it might be a good idea to get tested a few times throughout the year and then get a bit of an average.
Yeah.
I know that, again, City West Water, they have a minimum tested, a maximum tested, and a medium tested. So like when you're like doing your water, like you can look at the lowest number that they tested it at, the highest number they tested it at, and then the average.
Yep.
And I generally just go with the average.
Yep.
Because usually there's not too much variance between them.
Yeah, I found that too.
But that's really useful, and I don't know exactly how often they test it, but I think it's fairly regularly, like,
they do
once or twice a month, I think.
Yeah. Oh right. Yeah. Yep. Again, the West's really good at that. I think Yarra Water tests less frequently. Their reports maybe
Western
once a
suburbs,
year.
guys, what can I say? Holding it down. So yeah, I thought it worthwhile touching on what's going on with the water before we move too far into other things. How are we going for camera battery?
Pretty good. I reckon we've got, I don't know, we could have 20 minutes.
And we're not having to do the stop-start thing for the...
It's holding. I've worked out a few hacks that mean we don't have to pause it as much.
Hey,
so,
nice one. All right, we'll keep going then.
Yep.
We could knock all this out,
right?
With this momentum. All right, so back to malt. So we've kind of touched on, in a lot of my demos, particularly when we were in person, a lot of people that came to the demos were sort of very beginner level, entry level brewers, which is awesome. We all start there, and it's you're still discovering the amazing smells and sights and flavors of brewing. But malt is basically barley or some kind of grain that has been taken through a process to unlock the enzymes within said grain, which are responsible for breaking down the starches. So these grains store their energy in the form of starch. In order to utilize that starch for growth or for just general sort of living, it needs to be broken down into a simpler form so that it can be burned and used as fuel.
The plant can grow.
Yep. So human beings, also carbon-based life forms, also rely on carbohydrates to power our central nervous system. We rely on a lot of other things, obviously, as well, to keep our organs functioning and stuff. We can't just eat sugar. But our brains run on sugar. And that's what powers our body. We have a whole bunch of different things in our body which break down starch into simpler sugars, which our digestive system is then able to turn into energy.
Yep.
And keep our bodies running, keep us moving, keep us doing things, keep us in the pursuit of whatever it is that we're pursuing. Grains also have a bunch of different mechanisms for utilizing the starch that are contained within them. And we need to trick the grains into unlocking those mechanisms so that we can effectively hijack them and use them to make beer.
For our own evil purposes.
Yeah, for our own evil porpoises, which we keep in a tank out the back. So basically, the grain is flooded, then dried, then flooded, then dried, etc., until it sprouts. Once it sprouts, that process is halted, and the grains are then kilned to basically put the brakes on the whole process. The temperature and time at which it's kilned is where we get all the different kind of varieties of malts that we kind of get to play with. Like I mentioned earlier, we've got about sort of 60 or 70 different types of malt, I think, here. That's just a number I pulled out of my back pocket. I don't know if it's actually that many, but it's a lot. There's a lot of different things that come into play as to how that malt turns out. Modern malting facilities have really accurate and impressive measuring technology. So they know exactly the humidity levels, exactly the temperatures, all the different conditions that are happening throughout the whole malting process. They know exactly how modified the grains are before they send them to the kiln, so they can take them right to the edge before other enzymes start degrading them and pulling them and doing things that we as brewers don't want before kilning them, which makes them super easy to work with compared to malt 100 years ago, 50 years ago.
Very scientific, industrial, process.
And that's probably why you'll often hear people talking about like brewing German beer, saying you don't need to do all these different steps. Modern malt is so well modified that blah, blah, blah. I say, yeah, but it's fun.
Yeah.
Stop being such a nerd and enjoy yourself.
Yeah.
Oh no, I have to brew for longer than I have to. Oh, I hate brewing. I just want to get it over and done with. No, brewing's awesome. The longer you can spend in the, like, with your face over a mash tun, sniffing those aromas, the better.
Play with it, and sometimes, just do things because you can. Maybe this is an opportunity actually to talk on that term, modified, as well. Since we're talking about malting.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, there's not just amylase enzymes in barley. There's a whole bunch of different enzymes, and each of them have a specific role to play. And most of them we want to have done their job before the point that we get those grains. So we want to take charge of the starch conversion as brewers, because we want to control the sugar profile of the beers. We want to decide if it's going to be a thicker, chewier beer or a thinner, sweeter beer, or we want to do the amylase stuff, but we don't want to have to deal with the breaking down the starch cell matrix, breaking down the proteins and the gumminess and all those other like annoying hassles that are kind of part of dealing with unmalted grain. And if you ever have brewed with unmalted grain or cereals or things like that, and have had to like do a cereal mash to gelatinize the grain to make it available for mashing, and then bring it back down, and then it's just a whole nightmare. Thing. It's a massive pain in the ass. So the further the grains are taken in that malting process, up to the point where those amylase enzymes start converting the starch for us, which is what we don't want, basically the easier the grain is to work with, and the easier the grain is to work with, and the easier our job is.
So the malts are kind of doing the work for us in that way, so that the grain is as ready to go as possible by the time we get in our hands to use it. So when people talk about well-modified malt, what they're saying is that as much of those other processes as possible have kind of already been undertaken by the time we get our hands on the malt. And then so a lesser modified malt is in theory, it takes more work to extract those sugars as a brewer.
But it also means we've got more control and more say again.
Yes.
Which, so for some people, that's a really good thing.
There's positives to, just because a malt is quite under-modified. I mean, there's no, these days again, even though some malts are less modified than others, they're still pretty well, they're still like, even in historical context, they're pretty.
Yeah, modern
safe.
under-modified malt is like a brewer from 100 years ago would be like,
what is this magical substance?
But it's good fun to play with.
Yeah.
And you can make some really interesting things with less modified malts. You can get certain flavors and textures that you can't get from more modified malts. And I particularly enjoy using less modified Pilsner malts in like my Helles and in my Czech Pils.
The famous one probably being Bo Pils.
The Bohemian
right?
Pils.
Bohemian Pilsner by Weimann is less under-modified. Is that the term?
I think it's just slightly pretty much.
I think under-modified is probably not the right word.
It's slightly less than the other ones.
Slightly less modified, but yeah, that's one that people would typically go for when they're doing a traditional style. And as you said,
but I mean, you can even get your hands on like there's a few smaller craft maltsters popping up now, and it's quite possible that their malts aren't as modified either. And if they're small enough, you could even potentially, and if they're small enough and you're big enough, you could potentially commission under-modified malt from them as well to kind of really play with it and experiment, which I think is worthwhile. Like just. We're in the hobby because we like doing this stuff, I think, and getting to play with things like that and kind of, I don't know, experience different things, and it's just fun. I just think it's really fun.
Yeah. So just because you have a lesser modified malt doesn't mean you have to go through a whole cereal mash or multiple step mashes, but you can, and it's just part of the fun, and it can give you a result that perhaps you wouldn't get from a fully modified malt. It gives a bit more body and just other, I don't know, hard to define things in the beer.
I'm building a guitar at the moment, and I've bought a kit from like a company out in WA, Pitbull Guitars, which shout out to those guys if you guys want to build a kit guitar. They've really looked after me and awesome service. So again, not being paid to say that, but I basically stuffed up my order and contacted them to see if like I could send something back and get the one I wanted back, and they just sent me the one I wanted and said, don't worry about it, keep the other. So that's
Cool.
Now I've got like that's 2 necks, and I've nearly got enough to make 2 guitars for the price of 1 kit, so I'm pretty happy with it. But I'm using a kit because I haven't done it before, and I'll probably do a few kits before eventually what I want to do, get a big chunk of timber, cut it into shape and build it from scratch. And that's kind of the same thing as like using like a less modified malt, being able to like, having the malt handed to you, kind of everything's already sort of done. You're still learning, you're still building, like you're still kind of doing all the tricky, the main part of it, which is like mashing and all the rest, but sort of something cool about getting like an under-modified one as well, and really like controlling exactly like
under the hood
how it happens from go to woe. So yeah, it's something to be said for that, I think.
Cool. Well, speaking of batteries before, we're going to take a quick break.
Yeah, sure.
Just to do a camera thing, and then we'll be right back and perhaps just continue.
We're talking about Vienna Malt.
Yeah, talking about malt stuff. All right, be right back. we are back. Whoops, I'm on the wrong side of the screen there.
We're on?
Yeah, we're on. So perhaps maybe should we just finish our thoughts on malting, the malting process. So we talked about modified, and you talked about the germination process. But I guess basically malting is pretty much from the same base ingredient. I mean, where they source the wheat or the barley from will change, but pretty much from one ingredient, you wind up with what, 80, 90 or more varieties of different, countless varieties of malt that we use as brewers, and they achieve that through multiple
through temperature, through time, through humidity, like just changing. Like it's mostly those three variables.
And they'll wet the grain, then dry it, and then heat it to a certain temperature and kiln it, and then wet it again, and all those combinations we wind up with.
It's really amazing, and yeah, it's similar to beer, I guess. You know, like 3-4 ingredients, and we can make countless different things out of them, or even with like the same 3, like using Vienna malt, hallertau, and water. You know, like I could make probably 5 or 6 different beers easily. Even with the same yeast, just by changing up maybe the water chemistry, or maybe like adding more or less hops at different times, using a different amount of grain. Like you could make 4 or 5 completely different beers. It's really amazing, like just those few little changes, how big an impact they can make to
the final product. And so, was there anything else you wanted to say about Vienna malts? And
So this was all like a lead up to the actual specifics of Vienna. Like, what do they do to make it Vienna malt versus Pilsner malt, or Munich malt, or crystal malt, or chocolate malt? And why that makes it such a good malt to use as a base as well, which I thought was really interesting. So basically, it's your 3 main variables with your kilning are your humidity, your temperature, and your time. So with Pilsner malt and with Vienna malt, the moisture levels are pretty much the same, which is why it gets like kind of more of that dryness, more of that kind of base malt character to it. The main thing that changes is the temperature. So it's kilned a little hotter, which gives it a little bit more color, but it also, like, you get melanoidins and stuff coming out of that process, and you get sort of like toasting of the grains. And that's where that depth and that complexity and that richness comes from. So timing is pretty similar, but it's that, and moisture level is pretty much the same as your Pilsner malts, but it's that elevated temperature that just gives you the extra. Now with Munich malt, the temperature is pretty much on par with the Vienna. I think they kiln it a little bit longer maybe with the darker ones to get a bit more color on it. But the main difference there is the moisture level. So Munich malt has a much higher humidity. So the grains going into the kiln are wetter. The humidity inside the kiln is higher. And I'm not a chemist, but basically my understanding is the way that Maillard reactions work is that it's like there's that kind of interplay between sugars, heat, and moisture. So having that higher moisture level means you get way more melanoidins being produced in the same kind of temperature environment. So that's why I've sort of mentioned before, like there's an overlap in color between the Vienna and the Munich malts. But you can get these 2 grains which have been effectively treated in a lot of ways the same way, but because of that extra moisture, you get so much more richness and depth and intensity of flavor from the Munich malt. But what that also does is it changes the kind of the way that the grains behave. And again, I'm really sorry, I'm not a biologist or a chemist or a physicist or any of those ists. I'm just a guy standing in front of a camera, asking you to trust me. But yeah, so you need to take extra steps with Munich malt to kind of get the fermentability out of it as a result of that process. And there is some caramelization that happens with both Vienna and Munich malts, but particularly with Munich malts, you get like some caramel compounds formed along with the malanoidins. So it's a different malt, basically. Even at the same colour.
Yeah, right. So there you go again, just an example of one variable or a couple of variables change, they wind up with something from the same ingredient that's different. Can be a different product at the end of the day.
And all unique and special in their own ways, and I think that's why we love them. And that's why I keep saying brew this beer. You know, like get a bunch of Vienna malt and do a complicated mash with it, and throw some noble hops at it, and ferment it with a lager yeast with like care and painstaking attention,
labor over it. Because it's a dry beer, isn't it? It's malty, but it's dry. It's not sweet, but it has a sweetness, or it has a depth. A depth, maybe that's a better word. Yeah,
it's like Pilsner, and I mean Pilsner can be its own thing as well, but like talking about German rather than Czech, like because the Czech Pilsner has got a real depth to it as well in its own way, but that's a whole other conversation.
Quite hoppy and
there's things that happen there which contribute to the way that a Czech Pils comes out. But
it's a whole other show.
Yeah, if you're comparing a German Pils to like a Vienna Lager, for example, like the German Pils is super dry, it's super crisp, it's sharp, it's biting. The Vienna is definitely dry, but it's that depth, it's that. As a musician, I call it like the mid-range.
Okay. Yep.
It's that sort of
frequencies.
It's the legs that sort of sit underneath it and prop it up. Kind of gives everything a boost, gives everything an elevation, and it's those toasty, like subtle toasty malanoidin flavors that come from the Vienna malt that just gives it like that extra.
Yeah.
It's still pale. Like this beer will come out like not as pale as a Pilsner, but definitely not.
So it's not.
It's a pale beer.
Like a pale beer. Okay.
It will be yellowy.
Yep. Right.
Leaning towards copper.
Yeah.
But I would say paler than like a British pale ale.
Of course. Okay. Yes. Yeah. Because again, in my head, rather in error, just thinking I've got that Negra Modelo. In my head, and that's kind of what I think of. But you're right. Yeah.
Which is, again, great beer. Definitely. Yeah. Definitely. Any Mexican restaurant you walk into will have Negra Modelo. You should grab one and drink it and enjoy it. It's just really good, especially with Mexican food. Mm-hmm. But this is a different thing, but it's still a very good thing. It's that richness, that kind of maltiness, but it's not too rich. It's not too malty. Sure. It's not cloying. It's not sort of. And part of that comes from the hops. Your classic Oktoberfest beer that most homebrewers are aware of, because I think when most folk kind of say, I'm going to make a lager, you're still, like when you do that for the first time, you're probably still in that lager bad, like trying to get out of that lager bad mindset. And thing about an Oktoberfest is it's big, it's malty, it's rich, it's flavorful. And most people get away from lagers because they're chasing those big, exciting flavors.
Perhaps you're used to drinking ales, the big, flavoursome, hoppy ales, and you want to match it with something.
You're coming from like your kind of formative years drinking those sort of really light, yellow, fizzy, mass-produced macro lagers, which again, there's a place for them. I do have a soft spot. I was literally just telling Joel before we started streaming, on Thursday I had a really crazy, chaotic afternoon, running around everywhere, missing trains, missing appointments, and was like, I just needed a beer, so I went to the bottle shop, bought myself a long neck of Melbourne and necked it, and it was exactly what I needed. And it was sunshine celebrations that I went to, so they had plenty of great beers, like great sort of craft beers and hoppy things there, but that wasn't what I didn't need those. I needed a Melbourne bitter.
Yeah, sure. I can
hit the spot and did what I needed. But you kind of, when you grow up on those sort of really light, really sort of subtle beers, and then you discover hops, for example, you drink like a, for me, I mean, for a lot of people, I think it was like a Little Creatures Pale Ale, or like maybe a Fat Yak even, or Stonewall Pacific Ale, like all those sort of beers, which once you push your lupulin threshold through the roof, are just like
gateway beers,
pretty tame by comparison, but compared to like a Carlton Draft or a Tooheys New, they're like an explosion of new flavors you never thought were possible, and you go chasing more of those flavors and get sucked into the amazing hole that is beer discovery. When you do eventually sort of decide, I'm going to come back to lagers, it's usually like you're thinking something big and rich and malty and exciting and German. And Oktoberfest tends to be the one you go with. And Oktoberfest and Vienna Lagers are so similar style-wise that in the classic styles, the classic beer styles book, it's Oktoberfest/Vienna. And a lot of people refer to the beers as the same beer with like a slash in between them, or like, like also like a Vienna/Marzen, or it's an Oktoberfest/Vienna. Like it's, they're almost considered the same beer, which they're definitely not. And a huge part of why they're not is to do with the hopping.
Okay.
So obviously, as we've kind of touched on with the malt discussion, if you take a Vienna Lager recipe and swap the Vienna out for Munich malt, you'll definitely get a richer and deeper and different malt character, and a darker beer as well. But it still won't be a Märzen, it still won't be an Oktoberfest. And the same thing, if you take a Märzen recipe but just swap the grist out for 100% Vienna malt, it's still not going to be a Vienna Lager. I'm going to talk about something I don't normally talk about, and I don't normally put a lot of weight on, but I think with this style of beer, it is a really helpful thing, and that's the bitterness to gravity ratio.
Oh, okay, cool.
Sorry?
Oh, it's just saying cool.
Yeah. Sorry. I thought
something technical
was going on. No, that's all good.
You got the boiler going there.
So bitterness to gravity ratio is something that a lot of people like really get hung up on, and I don't think it's necessarily as intense a thing to kind of stress about, or at least not to an extreme extent. Like, I guess we're all kind of like when I'm doing recipe design, I'm kind of subconsciously thinking about it, but it's not something that I'm putting all my focus and energy into. Like I'm more thinking specifically about how to balance things. And
so there's this kind of ballpark rule. Some people take it as a rule, but I think what you're saying is that you shouldn't, and is that half of your gravity should be, your IBUs in your recipe should come to about roughly half the gravity of your beer. Is that sort of that exists?
Something that people say.
Something that people say, yeah.
And I would posit that is going to change for every beer style, because the way that the bitterness and the grains interact with different beers is going to wildly vary.
Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts in a beer. So, for example, that rule in practice, if you've got a beer that's has a starting gravity of 1050, then your IBUs, quote unquote, should be around 25 IBUs for that beer.
But if you're making an IPA, 25 IBUs
is not going to cut it.
IPA is not going to cut it.
Yep.
in a pale ale, that's not going to cut it. So yeah, it really comes more down to the specific balance of specific styles, and that's just going to come down to kind of what you're chasing. But I think with this beer, it really is a useful thing to think about. And the more I'm kind of like thinking about that as a ratio, the more I'm sort of starting to think, well, maybe it is kind of a useful.
In this case, maybe. Okay.
We'll just generally maybe it is a useful kind of way to explain, because I guess so much of it happens subconsciously. When like, I mean, for me personally, when I'm doing a recipe design and like I kind of know what the balance is, and I can sort of like, I'm looking at the numbers rather than a ratio or anything. I'm like, at this gravity with these grains, I know it's going to like come out kind of in this kind of intensity level. So I probably want about this many IBUs, because in my head the bitterness attached to that many IBUs will balance out the way that it should for that style kind of thing.
Just like
so it was like all those things are kind of happening.
Yeah, like when you get that brain connection, okay, I know what 30 IBUs tastes like roughly. I know kind of what 60 IBUs. That's sort of in my kind of 60 and 30 are sort of my two.
Yeah, reference points.
Reference points that I have, but everyone's different. But yeah, that's...
I'm exactly the same.
Oh, right.
Yeah, they're my two as well. But I think having a ratio of gravity to bitterness for different styles could be a really good thing that people should maybe, I don't know if it exists, but I think like maybe we should kind of make a bit of a record of, of that. So like when we're trying to explain to someone how to make a style of beer, just say like, well, the bitterness to gravity on this one should be about here.
Got it, and adjust it to...
That's going to be about where the balance is going to be for if you're using the right type of grains and you're in the right gravity range, like if you have your bitterness at this ratio, then that's going to be about
in context.
Right. Yeah. So who knows, like I've become a bit of a convert, and it all happened when I was doing this recipe.
Yeah, right. So just the last couple of weeks.
I was like, like I like to read a bunch of different perspectives on these things before I come to these demos, so that I get a lot of different people's opinions on how to make these beers, and every single one I saw was saying like you said before, like a ratio of like a bitterness to gravity ratio of 0.5 is really like gonna dial you in exactly where you need to be for the style. And so like rather than just doing my normal thing of around here, like around this many IBUs, I was like, oh, I'm going to look at the little ratio thing in Beersmith and see, like, set it to 0.5, get it as close to 0.5 as I can, and then see where the numbers. And it lined up exactly where I would have put it if I was doing it myself. So I was like, oh, okay. So yeah, there's something to that. So with this beer, bitterness to gravity ratio of 0.5
happens to be 0.5
is gonna dial you in.
But also what you're saying is that it'll vary depending on the style.
It will.
Every style will have its own.
So having like a blanket rule for all different. And when I started off, I kind of came out like I was dissing the idea of a bitterness to gravity ratio. I'm dissing the idea of having a blanket bitterness to gravity ratio.
Noted.
But if you have that ratio for this style of beer, that's going to get you the right amount of bitterness and dryness in the finish, which is going to balance out the richness of the malt.
Yep. Because obviously bitterness can make a sweet beer be perceived as drier, or it balances. Yeah,
it makes it go down easier. is the least charitable way I can think of putting it. But it's true. It takes a beer that has rich, sweet flavours and makes it more approachable and more sessionable.
Because sweet beers can be hard to drink, and there's this place for them. But generally you want a beer that's drinkable.
So with a Märzen, with a October, it's kind of hard to do Vienna Lager or a Munich like a Oktoberfest without referencing the other, because they're so tied together in lore and in everything else. But with a Märzen, you would have a lower ratio.
Okay, yep, sure.
So you don't want as much of that bitterness. You want the richness and the sweetness to kind of carry through.
Got it.
And your fermentation is where you really dry it out, which you'll do that here as well. But it's the Bavarian approach, which I always sort of say with your Bavarian beers, the beer garden test. If you can drink a litre of it in a hot beer garden in Munich and still want another one, then you've nailed the Bavarian style.
Yeah.
And that so much of that comes down to the fermentation. Whereas with this one, I think it leans a little bit more on the bitterness to kind of pull that into balance.
So perhaps a slightly higher finishing gravity for a Vienna Lager?
For the Oktoberfest.
Oktoberfest. Sorry. Okay, I'm getting you.
Slightly higher for the Oktoberfest. But
higher for the Oktoberfest, lower. Lower.
And that just comes down again to the malts. And if you were using, again, a lot of Oktoberfest recipes have a mix of Pils, Vienna, Munich, even some crystal thrown into them. And if you're doing that, you might get better attenuation on them. But if you're just using Munich malt, you'll probably get it down to maybe 10, 12. And you'll be struggling to push it down much further than that.
Inherently.
But if you're careful with the way you drop the temperature back down to lagering, the yeast will still continue to chew up longer chain sugars in the keg while it's lagering or in the bottle, and that's going to be where you get that dryness from. And I'd still say do the same with the Vienna, because you do want it to be dry, but it's a little bit different. This is a drier beer than the Oktoberfest, basically, and the hops is what kind of gives it that. And we're just using Hallertau. So any noble hop. So Hallertau, Tettnang, Perla, Spalt, Saaz, all work great.
Yeah,
I like to stick with hops from the Hallertau region because I just like hops from the Hallertau region. But you can absolutely use Saaz in this beer and it would work really, really well.
And Hallertau tradition or
Herzbrucker?
Because
you can probably use Herzbrucker
either or.
Yeah,
I mean they're often that's one I used to get confused by a lot. The difference between the two. Herzbrucker, is it more of an earthy sort of tobacco kind of spicy flavour, whereas
a little bit more floral as well. Right. I think the Herzbrucker.
And tradition is
like your cinnamon and your clovey kind of, but not like phenolic.
Yeah, okay.
It's more like your cinnamony, Christmassy, sort of spicy.
Brighter, perhaps. Is that a word to use compared to Herzbrucker?
I just like it. I just really like it.
Me too. And they don't.
It's hard to describe.
Yeah.
I definitely get cinnamon though. Like Hallertau for me, like I just really get cinnamon. I don't know why, but I get a big hit of cinnamon from it.
Yeah, right. I'll have to really think about that next time I try a beer with it.
You'll probably be like, what is he talking about?
Cinnamon.
But I mean, that's the thing with any of these kind of tasting notes or smelling notes, is that it's so personal and
there
unique.
Is a subjective.
We all have a completely different lived experience, which influences the way that our brains pull us with different chemical stimulus. So I sniff a chemical and straight away think, well, the example I always use is with Riggers and Simcoe hops. I smell Simcoe hops and I straight away go blackcurrant, Ribena. Riggers smelt Simcoe hops and straight away went cat piss.
Yeah.
And I've since found out that the chemical responsible is literally called the blackcurrant / cat piss aroma.
Oh, there you go.
And so it's the exact same thing we're smelling. So it wasn't even that just like the combination of different things like took us in different directions. It was the exact same chemical.
But you both had different associations.
I grew up drinking Ribena and have a really strong connection to that in my brain because I used to take a lot of tablets as a kid, and the Ribena was how I made the tablets go down, and I really enjoyed the flavour of it, and I just had this really strong inbuilt connection to blackcurrant in my head, whereas obviously Riggers
has lots of
spent a lot of time sniffing cats, so that's where his brain took him, and it's really, really fascinating how all that stuff works. So and you can play with it as well. I mean, I've talked about it on stream before, definitely at demos, but I don't know if I've talked about it on stream before, but like if you're making a stout, for example, using these roasted malts that have a certain flavour, like the roasted flavour to them, just putting a tiny bit of cocoa or the tiniest bit of coffee into one of those beers, a lot of those roasted flavours have connection points in our brain to coffee or chocolate.
Yes.
It doesn't take much for our brain to instantly make those connections, and all of a sudden all of those roasted flavors are bringing us into chocolate.
Yeah.
Your brain's going, this is chocolate.
Yep.
Or this is coffee.
Yeah, it's funny, for chocolate and malt, I get coffee from mostly.
Yeah.
I don't get chocolate at all, really.
So Joe White chocolate malt, I get coffee.
Yeah.
Simpson's chocolate malt, I get chocolate.
Okay, yeah, okay, I'll have to use more Simpsons. Well, not that I mind coffee flavours in my beers, so yeah, that's interesting. This goes to show.
Brown malt, I get toast that's taken just that little bit too far.
Same, yeah, definitely. It's funny, sour beers, a lot of sour beers that have been aged in oak, I get sherbet notes from.
Yeah.
And I said that once and people just looked at me weird. But it's
Even
just
ones
like
that
sherbet,
haven't,
it's like,
Saison, I get sherbet from quite a lot. Particularly that Belgian Saison yeast, the 3724, I get heaps of sherbet. And I use that as a descriptor in my one of my BJCP practice exams, and the person who was training us up said, like, I don't think you can use that as a descriptor. People might not know what you mean. And I was just like, oh,
really?
Okay.
Yeah.
Which, fair enough.
Fair enough, I guess. But
unless I'd written whiz fizz or something instead of sherbet. I don't know.
Oh, okay. So it was.
It might have been something like
whiz
that.
fizz. All right. Yeah.
But yeah, I get a huge Saison de Pont is like a bag of whiz fizz for me.
Yeah, there you go. I don't get so much in that, but definitely something about oak tannins or oak flavours mixed with sourness gives a sherbety sort of thing for me. But yeah. I don't know. What anyone out there who's listening? Do you have anything to add to that? I'd love
a big
to hear
one was Styrian Golding. So this was a Dan thing. So Dan, who did the demo last stream, and he's sort of first all grain demo. I came to a grain and grape when I was kind of getting set up, and it was Dan and Jeff, and Dan referred to Styrian Goldings as fruit tingles.
Yes. Right. Yep. Okay.
And I can't not think that now. And it's awesome. Like I've attempted to make beers actually. That was the weird when those frozen berries had the hepatitis outbreak.
Oh, okay. Yes.
And it didn't end up getting to ferment it. But I literally made a beer with Styrian Goldings, frozen raspberries, and the Belgian wheat yeast, which has like a really strong bubblegum ester.
Yeah. So you were really
trying to make like fruit tingle beer with like all those things.
Yeah, so yes, okay, Styrian Goldings and fruit tingle. I'd not heard that one. Another one I'll have to think of when I'm trying a.
It seems bizarre, but then you smell it and you're just like, oh my god, it is absolutely fruit tingles. But that's the fun of all these things.
Yeah.
You know, like you look at I used to look at like those wine tasters and think that was such wankers.
I know, right?
And like, what are you talking about, you idiot? It's grapes. But like, yeah, then when you start learning about it and doing it with beer and stuff, it's like, oh no, they're actually 100% right. And it's just training your brain to make those connections is the hardest thing. Is like attaching a name to that thing that you're recognizing, and the more you do that, the quicker those connections happen. And you know, if you learn to do it in beer, then you can do it with wine. You can do it with anything.
Coffee, that's a whole, any sort of boffiny, a little nerdy sort of.
And then all your friends will be like, "Oh,
this
when
guy.
did they become such a bloody wanker?" I don't care about the blueberries you're tasting in that.
Yeah. When you start talking about, just drink the beer. Stop talking about it.
Yeah, so that pretty much covers the wort production side of the Vienna Lager, I think. I think with any lagers, every stage is really important with the German stuff. Like your mash is really important, your ingredient choice is really important, and then your fermentation is really important, and your packaging is really important. Like the whole thing from mashing in to pouring a pint is like a lot more critical. I think with a lot of ales, and this isn't to take away from them, but it's, you tip your wort in a barrel, throw yeast at it, come back in a couple of weeks to throw some hops at it, and then you're done.
They're pretty forgiving, yeah.
Whereas I think to really nail these European styles, you've got to be doing things right. Oh, and then there is, I guess, wiggle room. You don't have to nail everything to perfection, but the more things you can, the more best practice you can apply, the less chance you are to not hit one of the markers.
And if you don't get it right the first time, you'll get it on the next one.
Yeah, and you'll still make a good beer. It just won't be necessarily the beer that you're really kind of striving for. And yeah, so that's part of the rewarding, one of the rewarding parts of brewing them as well is because there is that little bit more care and attention to detail that goes into it. It's the payoff's better at the end. Like you really kind of feel like you earned the beer. And then of course they disappear all too quickly because they're bloody delicious and moreish. A well-made lager is, particularly your Bavarian style lagers, and like this one is another example of one of those kind of types of beer. So much delicious, rich, awesome flavour which disappears as soon as you've swallowed.
Yeah, right. So
and then you just leaves you wanting more and more and more and more. So it's so easy to just, like I said before, the beer garden thing, like to smash down 3 litres by accident because you just keep wanting to go back and have more. It's a beautiful thing and a dangerous thing.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
But the fermentation really is a critical part of it. And I guess the first step in that is choosing the right yeast. It's probably going to come as no surprise to anyone who's seen a few of my lager-related streams or been to any of my lager-related demos that I'm going to be using Bavarian Lager 2206 on this one. It's my absolute favourite yeast. It gives a cookie dough kind of character to beers for me. And by that I don't necessarily mean it tastes like you're drinking cookie dough. But the things about cookie dough that make cookie dough so great are present in the beer.
It's right.
Like, cool. Yeah, it's hard to describe, but something about it just
bready, sort of sweet.
Yeah, bready, sweet, buttery. Not buttery like Diacetyl, but like rich.
Yep.
And kind of floury, but not like. Well, there's just something about it. It just brings out something in the malt that reminds me of the same kind of guilty joy of eating cookie dough.
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
is drinking beers made with that yeast, and I think it's a really good thing to have in this type of beer. It can be a bit of a pain sometimes with attenuation. Right. You really need to treat it right. But that's not to say you can't address things if they come up, but it's worth monitoring the fermentation. The little tilt hydrometers that we sell are awesome for that because you don't have to pull a sample every 5 minutes to see how your beer's doing. It'll give you like a real-time readout of changes in gravity and stuff.
Yeah, I found those really helpful with lagers. Yeah,
it's not always going to give you the exact, perfect, accurate gravity, but you can see how it's changing and if it's not changing, and then you can like pull a sample and take a reading, or like you can intervene in some way. But I would say the way to treat it right comes down to mostly your pitch. So using the freshest pack you can get your hands on is a really good starting point, but it's not necessarily the only way to achieve it. But what you really need to do is build up a really good, really strong, healthy starter. Under-pitching really healthy yeast is almost always better than over-pitching weak yeast. Because if they've got enough momentum and they've got sort of enough kind of vitality,
then kind of push through the lack of numbers.
That said, don't underpitch.
That's not an excuse to underpitch or reason to underpitch.
So I would say if you're using a nice fresh smack pack, you'll probably get away with about a 2-litre starter on a stir plate. And if you can, use wort from the kettle. So if you're cubing, pull off a couple of litres from your kettle at the start of the boil into your flask, let that cool down, get your yeast in there, get it on a stir plate, and you're gonna get twice as much yeast growth out of a stir plate as what you will from a shaking or a swirling. And using the wort that you're going to be fermenting means that you can pitch the whole starter at high Krausen when the yeast is at its most active. So you're basically giving it a run up to the beer. So right out the gate, it's chewing through, it's powering on. The other benefit is that you've acclimatized the yeast to the exact conditions they're going to be working under, except temperature, because I would recommend doing a little bit warmer, maybe 15 degrees for your starter, if you can manage that.
Okay. Yep.
But you have basically set them up to get used to the exact type of sugars in the presence of the exact type of kind of bitterness and all those like different variables, the density of the liquid that that they're going to be operating in, so that they're really going to do a good job when they get into your beer. So using wort that resembles as closely as possible the wort that you're actually going to be fermenting.
Yes.
I find personally is good.
And
now, the literature doesn't necessarily agree with that. So this is purely anecdotal on my part, and I'd probably trust the biologists who write books about yeast, who say that the optimal gravity for yeast starters is 1035.
Ah, I see.
To do with like cell density and the way that the yeast interacts with it. But you still get more cells from higher gravity. You just get less efficient cell growth. So the yeast won't multiply as efficiently as they would in a lower gravity were. But I don't think that that's a problem if I'm just going to pitch this straight into the beer.
Yep.
I think it's better to have a wort which is basically the beer that I'm making, so I can pitch the whole thing in, get every last cell that's been built up in there, and pitch it at high Krausen so that it's really active and good to go. Because if you do a 1035 starter, then you have to cool it to decant the yeast out, get the liquid off the top.
Yes.
That's slowed the yeast right down, it's made them sluggish, and then you've got to wake them back up to get... It's a lot of kind of fussing around, and it's kind of a lot of stop-start for the yeast.
Yeah, there is.
I feel like keeping that momentum going and getting them moving is a really good thing. The other thing which I think is really critical, like I mentioned before, is pitching a healthy rate. So pitching healthy amounts. So I pitch my lager yeast at 7 degrees. And then I'll let the temperature rise up to 10 and hold it steady at 10 for the course of fermentation. The reason why I do that is that the precursors to diacetyl, which is like a butterscotchy sort of thing, they can also create another, the precursors can also go in another direction and make like a honey type thing, pantaneodyne I think it is, or something.
I know it's some weird long
along
word.
those lines.
Yeah,
it's like really sort of honey kind of flavour.
Yep.
They get created during the initial growth phase of fermentation. By pitching at 7 degrees, you're slowing that growth stage right down, which means that less of those precursors are going to get created, which means that the yeast has less diacetyl and random VDK things to chew through to get rid of to make your beer what you need it to be at the end. The kind of side effect of that is that you're getting less growth in that initial growth phase. So it's really important that you're pitching enough yeast to counter that. So whatever your yeast calculator tells you need to pitch for your lager at X gravity, pitch above that. Go a higher. So like if you're doing like this one's going to be I think about 1050. So I would go with the high gravity lager option in the yeast pitch calculator rather than the regular one.
Oh yes.
To make sure that I'm like the amount of cells that I'm putting into the beer are adequate to counter the lower growth that's going to be happening at those lower temperatures. That coupled with the high Krausen momentum vitality piece, means that I tend to knock out a 10-degree fermentation in a week.
Wow. So obviously there's something that works there. So yeah, just to recap, so you're saying using...
I've just dropped a lot of information.
Yeah. I'll see. This is going to test my memory here. Using this wort straight from your that you've made on brew day as your starter,
or something similar.
Or something similar if you can. Okay, yeah. I guess the downsides of that is that you are locked into the gravity that you produce on the brew day if you haven't somehow manufactured some, a separate starter on the side.
Yeah.
So you're using a higher gravity in your starter than is generally considered optimal.
Unless it's a 1035 beer.
Unless it happens to be 10, unless you happen to be making a mid-strength beer, yeah. But you're saying that that's the condition. That's you just work around that, and it seems to work fine.
I feel like the benefits outweigh.
The benefits outweigh any potential downside. So you can add that whole starter to the beer versus if you're making a starter separately, you've got to decant because you don't want to put. That starter's going to be it's going to have its own flavour that you don't want to add.
If 2 of the 20 litres of beer that you're making are just like Pils DME with no hops, fermented on a stir plate and all gross, then you don't want 10% of your beer to be that.
Yes, yeah, because it'll impact the flavour. So, and then also it saves a lot of fiddling around too, what you're suggesting. And fermentation-wise, so you chill your wort down. I guess you cube it generally, but if there's any other methods people have at their disposal to chill the wort down to 7 degrees Celsius. We're talking about Celsius, and then you can put the whole starter in. You don't need a decant or anything like that, and then you just let it free rise to 10. You just turn the fridge off or set it to 10 or whatever, and let it. It'll get there in a day or two, I assume.
I set the thermostat to 10, and then just unplug the heater.
Okay, yeah. So you're not heating. Yeah,
and then once it hits 10, I can plug the heater back in, and then if it needs to, which it rarely is going to drop too far below 10 in a fridge.
It's probably not going to want to kick the heater on anyway. But so but don't artificially rise that temperature is what you're saying. Between that 7 to 10.
Let the yeast get up there themselves.
The yeast will do it. They'll create. Temperature that
and they'll do it pretty quickly too.
Yeah. So okay, cool. Yeah, and if anyone is interested in the whole starter process, we did do a stream on that, so you can check that out. Again, keep an eye out. I know I keep saying this, but eventually I'll be editing that down into sort of bite-sized chunks that are a bit more digestible, just to the pertinent points. But definitely for lagers, yeast starters are a pretty important part of making a good lager.
I think with a lager, you just need to tick as many boxes as you possibly can for your yeast. And if you can't tick them all, then make sure you tick all the ones you can. Is the other thing I'd say, because you can get away with it, but the more boxes you've got ticked, the better your chances are of getting the result that you're chasing at the other end.
Yeah. Fewer chances.
Big one would be oxygen. Yes. Definitely oxygenate your wort with a lager. I've got one of those oxygen bottles, little mini regs and a stone. I get that in there, give it a 60-second blast, and that's plenty to give it what it needs.
Yep.
If you don't have access to one of them, you can, at the very least, tip it from bucket to bucket, or get a whisk in there. Do what you can to get as much air into it as you can initially, so that the yeast has oxygen to kind of do what it needs to do. Nutrients, which we'll be adding in the boil here. I add nutrients to every brew. It helps with attenuation, it helps with everything basically. It's a good idea to do. Particularly in Melbourne, the magnesium level in Melbourne water is really low. Yeast needs magnesium, so you can add it as a
little bit of
water, but if you use, you absolutely can. Add it as Epsom in your water, but you can also, and I recommend getting the Yeast does a nutrient blend. It's got diammonium phosphate in there, it's got zinc, it's got magnesium, it's got all sorts
All the
of
stuff yeast want.
good things for healthy yeast, and half a teaspoon to a teaspoon of that in every 20-litre brew.
Don't need a lot.
Chuck it in with your findings in the last 10 minutes, and all your beers, you'll see an improvement. You'll absolutely see an improvement. You might not notice the improvement, but then if you stop doing it, you'll notice the
it's
the unimprovement,
yeah.
which I think tends to be the way with a lot of these things. Like when you add them into your process, and then I don't know if this is any better, but then if like on one brew day I didn't have any findings, and I thought, oh, I'll be all right. I'll just put extra calcium in the water and it'll be fine. And it was this murky, horrid mess of beer. And I'm just like, okay, I need to remember to put findings in. And it's the same with stuff like nutrient, with salts, with all those things. You don't always notice them straight away, but then when you take them away from your process, you do notice the difference. And the other thing I would say is monitoring your fermentation. So I mentioned it earlier. If you do those other steps, you'll probably find that considering it's a 10-degree ferment, it's surprisingly vigorous.
Yeah, right.
Which kind of blows me away every time, particularly if you use, so the other lager yeast I'll use a bit is the 2124, the Bohemian lager. That is a monster at 10 degrees if you do those other steps.
Yeah,
It powers through. I get a Krausen at 10 degrees.
Yeah, right.
On those fermentations.
Not being a huge lager brewer myself, it's not something I...
But yeah, you'll probably power through it, no dramas whatsoever, and not have any issues, but you still have to monitor. You still have to keep an eye on it. So the Bavarian lager yeast likes to stop dropping at about 10-15, 10-16. And getting those last few gravity points can be a little bit of a hassle. But generally, like if you sort of hit 10-15, 10-16 and keep an eye on it from that point, if it doesn't seem to be dropping, then chuck a degree or two onto the fermenter until you see the movement kick off again, and then that'll generally get you down. I'd never go over 15 degrees.
Raising it.
But usually, this is relatively recent, like only the last couple of years I've started doing this new process.
Yep.
Since I've been doing that, I haven't had to do that. I haven't had
no diacetyl rest.
No diacetyl rest, no. You don't need to. If you do...
if you're doing everything properly up front, yeah,
and if the yeast is happy and chugging along and doing what it needs to do, then you shouldn't need it.
Yep.
And Julian, actually, from Sour and Piglets, who's a brewery out in Port Campbell, is it? No, not Port Campbell.
I do forget
Port
where
Fairy, one of the ports.
Exactly where they're from.
They're in a port out in Western Victoria. But he's a German himself and studied in Germany and sort of said, no, you just ferment at 10 degrees and you do it until it's finished. You don't
just let it go. Right, yeah.
And I kind of took that on board.
It's a bit of a...
If I don't have to, I won't raise it. But sometimes if the fermentation is stubbornly staying at a gravity which I think is too high for most of these types of beers, which 10-15 definitely is.
Yep.
Giving it that extra little bit of warmth, just to kind of encourage it down to where you want it to be. You want it to finish, I would say the highest I would be happy with for a Vienna or a Märzen would be 10-12. Ideally 10-10 would be great. But the other thing is it is going to continue to dry out in lagering as well. And that's where the kind of the final step of this process comes in, which is I've had Brendan O'Sullivan, who's an absolute legend and a genius and makes incredible beers, said to me that this is pointless and I shouldn't worry about it, but I don't care. I'm going to keep doing it because it's in my process and I believe that it works, so therefore I assert that it does. Taking it down, so once I've hit the gravity that I want to hit, it's stabilized, everything's sort of what I need. Usually about the 2-week mark, I'll sort of start this process. I'll knock off a degree a day, getting it down to about as low as I can keep it, basically. So I lager in my keg fridge, I just make sure not to connect the beer line to it, so I'm not tempted to drink it.
Sure, you just leave the keg in there and let it do its thing. Yeah.
And my keg fridge sits at about 2 degrees, so I'll take it down to 2 degrees. If you can manage lower, it's better. Like the closer you can get to 0, the better. If you can lager at 0 degrees, perfect. But 1 degree a day until I hit that 2 degrees, then I'll keg it in a chilled keg. Make sure you put your keg in the fridge before.
Okay.
And that's just a general tip. Even for like ales or whatever, stick your keg in your keg fridge empty after it's been cleaned and everything, like in the day or 2 leading up to filling it. And that means that your beer is going to be going into a cold keg, it'll carbonate more readily. All the things that you want to happen are just going to happen better. But particularly if you've just gone to all the hassle of lagering your beer down to 2 degrees, then you're throwing it into a keg that you've just had hot OxyClean in.
Yeah.
You're straight away bringing it back up in temp, and you've kind of undone all that sort of hard work to slowly
bring it down, because then you're going to put it in the fridge and then you're going to crash it from
shop
whatever.
it down again.
So
chill your keg. 1 degree a day, chill your beer. Get your beer into your keg, seal it up, put the gas on it, and forget about it for a month.
Yep.
And that will, if you do all of those things, I will be very surprised if you don't end up with an amazing beer. Because these types of beer are all about process.
Yes.
And if you nail the process, you nail the beer. Everybody has their own unique approach to this eventually.
Yeah.
I mentioned Riggers before. Riggers brew some awesome lagers, like really good lagers, and his approach to brewing lager is almost unrecognizable to mine. Completely different, but I like his beers. I'm pretty sure he likes my beers, the ones he's had of them. I'm pretty bad at remembering to bottle beers and bring them in to share, so I'm hopeless when it comes to that. But yeah, we both make good lagers, but we just make them in a different way. It's not necessarily one's right and one's wrong. The reading I did and the sort of the research that led me to my processes is different to the reading and research he did leading to his processes, and they've both come from legitimate sources and they both have legitimate results. It's similar to when we did the NEPA stream, we were talking about like the 2 different approaches to the yeast and to the fermentation. It's the same sort of thing. There isn't a wrong way.
Yep.
But they are different, and they will give you different results.
Yep.
But different's not necessarily bad.
Sometimes it's just what works for you as well.
But once you've got your processes in place and you're happy with the results, lock them in. Like that's the way you do that from that point on. And the more consistent you can be with those processes, the more consistent they'll naturally start to become, because it's a routine, it's a mechanical sort of process that you're going through. And like, I just blasted so many different steps and so much information, and it seems probably a bit overwhelming, but if you do it every time that way, you're not even thinking about the 20 jobs you've got to do. You've got the one job, which is get the beer into the fermenter and then get it from the fermenter into the keg. Like, all those little steps are just all that one job, and it doesn't seem like you're doing lots. It's just...
Yeah, it becomes muscle memory.
It's like brewing. Like, it's like mashing, you know? Like, the first time you do an all-grain brew, you're like, oh, then I've got to put the grain in the water, and I've got to get the salts,
there's so many
then I've got to
steps,
check the temperature, and I've got to set an alarm, and then I've got to, whereas like now it's just like, I'm brewing.
Yeah.
That's my one job for the day. I've got to brew the beer.
So it's always hard at first, especially when you're incorporating a new process or a bunch of new processes. With lagers, there's a whole new sort of like aspect of brewing to get your head around if you've only ever brewed ales. But as I think we've said quite a lot, it's worth it. It is worth a very rewarding style of brewing.
Yeah, especially, I mean, there's a few rewards, but I guess the biggest reward is the beer at the end.
Well, that's the most important step, isn't it? The drinking part.
And you can sort of approximate. We obviously do a couple of fresh work kits here, lager fresh work kits. And if you take one of those fresh wort kits and you apply those fermentation processes to them, you'll get a perfect, beautiful lager. But a lot of people, when they're first getting started and they get those, they want to brew a lager, they want to brew like a Helles or something, but they've not ever brewed before, they don't have temperature control. So we send them home with an ale yeast, like a good neutral ale yeast. Usually I tend to go with Danstar Nottingham because it accentuates the malt, but it still ferments clean and it gets you like a facsimile of a lager.
Yeah.
That is totally workable when it's your first getting started and you just want to brew beer in that kind of vein. You'll be pretty happy with the results, but it's not going to be what it would be if you used a lager yeast, you pitched it properly, you did all those steps and you really kind of put the work in. And if you put those two beers side by side, you just be like, oh, yeah, I really want to learn how to brew lagers. And that's what happened with me. The first lager I brewed, funnily enough, was a Vienna Lager. But I didn't know what I was doing. I just assumed that yeast was an ingredient like malt or like hops or whatever else. And if I put the correct yeast into the correct wort, it would give me the beer. So I pitched one smack pack of lager yeast into a fermenter full of wort that was kind of Vienna Lagerish, and ended up with just the biggest diacetyl bomb you've ever seen in your life, almost undrinkable. And I was like, what went wrong? I put the right yeast in there. Yeah, it said lager on the thing. And when I looked up what to use for a Vienna lager, it said, oh yeah, use this type of lager yeast. I'm like, okay, one smack pack, in you go. So I'd spent a month like reading about how to brew lagers properly, because I think it was like the first time where a beer had gone terribly wrong and it wasn't like some kind of like cleaning issue or some kind of like like oxidized in the bottles or anything like that. It was like I did all these things, but something's gone terribly wrong and I don't know what, and I had to like figure out what it was. So like, I read heaps and kind of schooled myself up as well as I could, and then came back and had another crack. I think the next lager I tried to brew was a Czech Pils, and nailed it. Yeah. And that was kind of like, was a really big moment in terms of sort of feeling like taking control and being like, I can do any of these things. I just need to do the research first, look into it, and
nail the process.
Use it, nail the process. And I think that's when I really fell in love with brewing lagers, because.
Are you right there in your hand?
Yeah, if you could just swing by and slide the. I really should have thought this through.
Yep.
There we go. So normally the Braumeisters have like a crossbar that slides along the thing, and you sit the lugs on the crossbar and it sort of hangs there. But I like to use a trivet because I'm difficult. But I probably should have thought that through. It's much easier to just lift it and twist it and put it down normally. Where was I? Process.
I think you just about the lightning moment of where you realised it was about process.
And I just fell in love with that process and with like kind of nailing it down and making it my own as well. And I think that's something really special about lager brewing is it kind of, it's almost like a ritualistic thing in a lot of ways. It's sort of like, this is getting really wanky now, but you know how like the Japanese have like the tea rituals and stuff like that, sure. and it's like there's something really kind of calming and sort of meditative about it, and that's kind of what lager brewing is to me in a way. Like it's
you got to be very present too, I guess, because
really mindful and really sort of focused on it, and just kind of going through those steps and trying to repeat those steps exactly as you have in the past. And like chasing that process, sort of, it does become a bit of like a bit of a thing. I guess.
Ritual.
Yeah. But then like a lot of those best practices and a lot of those techniques and things translate into other brewing.
Yeah, exactly. That
well.
you'll carry those into any beer you make.
Looking after your yeast, just because you don't have to as much on other beer styles doesn't mean it won't improve your beer. So things like making sure you're doing a starter, really being conscious of how much yeast you need and how healthy it is, and all of those things drastically improve all of your beers. And if you do get into the process of brewing lagers and going to that extra effort to get the good beers out, then when you are doing an ale and you don't have to do as many of those steps, it's going to seem so much easier. As well.
That's true.
Like you just knock them out without even kind of hardly thinking about them. All right, so I always forget to do that when I'm doing a demo.
Right.
Hit the tick a couple of times to let it start heating to the boil. I've got a jug here. I've got an urn with 80-degree water in it. So I'm just going to pour water through the grains until it comes up to the 25-litre mark on the central tie rod. And that means I will have the sufficient amount of liquid in the kettle that I'll fill a cube at the end of the boil. If I was being really sort of on the ball, I guess, if I was sort of really kind of trying to do things to the letter, this is the point where I'd take a gravity sample with a refractometer and figure out based on where I'm at. So I've got 20 litres in there at the moment. I can take that gravity sample, find out exactly how much sugar I've got in there, and that will inform me on what level of dilution to hit it with. So I'll even know like my pre-boil volume, because I know that this is going to boil off almost exactly 3 litres of water over the course of the boil, because I've done enough brews on it now that every time I do it, it boils off about 3 litres.
Yep. So you're running a little blind today. You know you're going to hit 23 litres. That's your target volume, but your actual gravity could be, it's a little bit of an unknown. But I guess you've done this enough times.
I wouldn't even say I'm running blind at this point.
Yeah, fair enough.
Like I've brewed on this thing in this room with this water so many times that I just have dialed in the efficiency. I know what I'm gonna hit, and I'm gonna get my numbers.
Yep.
Like it's bad to say that, but I don't think it's necessary for me right now. Just making this, I'm gonna fall within the range of the style. Anyway, I shot gravity-wise. I've shot exactly in the middle of the style, so I'm gonna fall within the range of a Vienna Lager.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, and it might be a point or two difference, but it's going to be in the range. And this is the
one and only time I'm brewing this beer, so I'm not like, if I was doing it at home, I would take a reading. I'd do it all like by the book, but it's not so necessary today. But if I was going to do that, I've spoken about it before, the formula for figuring out your dilution.
Yeah, actually, that's
which I learnt from the great Hendo himself.
But yeah, run us through that again. I do recall that being a good tip. So Hendo has a website and a YouTube called Rockstar Brewing. Hendo used to work here. He went on to work at a bunch of really cool breweries and started Brew Cult. And now he's started Rockstar Brewing Academy, which he basically teaches professional brewers how to dial in their processes, because it's all about process, to get the best beer that they can. So I try to watch his videos as he makes them and learn from him, because he's a really smart dude and knows what he's talking about. And he did a video on calculating your dilution rates to hit your gravity, which I always had a calculator, like on an app on my phone to do that. But said app
didn't carry across in my last phone upgrade. So I was flying blind, and then I remembered seeing that video, so I went and found it, and it's actually really, really simple, simple process. So basically, I might even, just to make sure that I don't get it wrong, because I just said it's so simple, and then if I tell you wrong, I've got a note saved in my phone of that exact formula. Where are we? Evernote. Here we go. So you take your current volume and your current gravity, multiply them together, and then divide it by your target gravity. Sounds like a lot, but it doesn't matter what units you use.
Okay, so metric or imperial.
So if you're using bricks, if you're using Bome, I guess.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
But I would use
Metric.
specific gravity.
Oh, a specific. Okay, got it.
And if you're using litres or pints or barrels or whatever,
Yep.
doesn't matter.
Okay, so it translates to
Yep.
all units.
So for the purposes of not making things weird, let's use the units that we're all familiar with.
Sure.
So we currently, so at the start of the boil, or at the start of like the end of the mash, we had 20 litres at say, let's say 10:45. I didn't measure it, but let's say that's what it was.
Yep.
So we take the 1.0 off that and just use 45 as the number.
Okay. Yep.
So we say 20 times 45, which is 80, 90. And then we divide that by our target gravity of, say, 50. So 90 divided by 50. Is that right?
Sorry, look, my multitasking skills are terrible. I do have a calculator on here though.
I'm going to pull up my calculator and double check
with the
this.
computer too much, it'll crack.
So I feel like I'm bad at describing things. So we have 20 times 45, 900. There we go. 900 divided by 50. 20 times 45 is 900. Divide that by 50, we get 18. So if we had 1045 as our starting gravity,
yep,
and we wanted to hit 1050 as our end of boil,
yep,
we need to end up with 18 litres in the kettle.
Okay. So that tells us how much we need to boil off.
So we would have needed to boil off 2 litres of that. Now we are sparging up to 25 litres, and that's going to add a little bit of sugar, but it's also going to add a little bit of water. So we don't know exactly what effect that's going to have on the gravity overall.
So you'll probably need to measure.
So I would wait until we'd sparged up to 25 litres probably, and then take that gravity and then figure out.
And then work out.
But it's not going to matter. Because the amount of sugar in there is constant.
Yep.
So it will matter in terms of sparging.
You'll have added a little bit of sugar. So you probably
but like it's not, if we didn't sparge,
yep,
we just need to boil off 2 litres, which we would end up boiling off 3. So we'd need to add a litre of water into the kettle at the end of the boil to get to our 18 litres. Now that we've sparged, we get a different amount. So say it's 1046.
Might be more. It'll be slightly higher.
At 25 litres. All we would do then is we'd say 46 times 25, it's 1150 divided by 50, 23 litres.
Okay,
so we want
there
to
you
end
go.
up with 23 litres.
So we want to hit 23 litres. Yeah.
So it's really simple.
That is a really good tip.
And it's, once I found out how easy it was, because I just never bothered to think about the maths, I just had an app.
Yeah.
And so many of these like brewers that have started in the last 5-10 years have always had an app or a program or something to do the work for them. Watching that video and realizing like it's really just like 3 numbers, a really simple process of calculating it out. It's a really easy way to take complete control of the beer you're making.
Yeah. And often you have to make water calculation adjustments on the fly. So that's a really good one to, yeah. So thanks, Hendo.
Yeah, massive. So say that was 1046 when I get up to 25 litres. I know that I'm going to boil off 3 litres every time in this room with this unit. So I would add an extra litre in. I would just take a jug and pour an extra litre of water in there above the 25 litres, because that means I'm going to end up with that 23 litres at the end of the boil. And I'll have my gravity exactly where it needs to, and then I might do some quick calculations to see how much more hops I need to add.
I was just going to say.
For the 23 litre end instead of a 22 litre or 21 or whatever I calculated it to.
Final volume, the wort is the final volume is higher than what the recipe was, or what you're predicting is going to make the hops, throw the hops out, because it's going to be, the hops will be diluted in that larger volume of liquid, so you'll have less bitterness.
Yep. And the other thing I would do as well is I would just add a litre to whatever literage I calculated the recipe to, rather than doing it to what I'm actually going to end up with, because I calculated it to a certain amount. And based on a 25 litre boil.
Yep.
So if I'm starting with 26 litres, I just add a litre to whatever my my program that I'd calculated I was going to end up with, because I'll end up with a litre more.
So just
regardless of what the numbers are, I'm going to adjust it based on that rather than on
20. Yeah. So you're working off a 26 litre boil, even though 25 is...
Because I might not have ended up with 20 litres at the end of it anyway, regardless, for a variety of reasons, grain absorption, who knows what else.
There's always little things.
I'm calculating to get the IBUs for...
what's in the kettle, as opposed to what winds up in the fermenter.
And when we said before, the number of IBUs isn't as important as the perception.
Yes. Yeah. And the difference between, well, I won't say that point, because I'll get it wrong. Because it depends on the beer. I was going to say the difference between 5 IBUs may not be noticeable, but in a light beer it might be noticeable.
If I'm confusing people as well, let me know, because I might have just been talking in circles.
We are, we're talking about maths and numbers and things. Conceptually, it's a bit hard to maybe get, this will be an example of a video that I'll edit, and I'll put some graphics up, and just to help explain it
At this
visually.
point, Ben continued to talk nonsense for. But it's a really simple process that you can add into your brewing, which means that again you can just get that consistency. If you are in control of the gravity and the bitterness of your beers, then every time you make that beer, you can make it exactly the same, and you know that it's going to be the same. That's what breweries do. That's when a brewery releases a beer, and then they release it again, and they release it again, and it tastes the same each time. The reason why it tastes the same each time is because they're doing these things. Like they're figuring out exactly how much they need to end with to get the exact gravity they want, and then they're factoring that into their hopping rates, into their all those other things that they're doing, and so the output is consistent.
It's a finely tuned operation.
And just putting the same amount of grains in the same amount of water every time isn't going to work, even in the same system, because the grains are going to be slightly different. Each time you're going to get slightly different efficiency. The weather might be different, the humidity might be different, all these different factors might come into play. So relying on, I did the same recipe, so therefore the beer will be the same, it doesn't quite work like that. But if all you're brewing for is to have delicious beer to drink, that's all you need to do.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about all that stuff. Again, it's just about what the practices are, what the ways of achieving certain things are, and if a lot of people have the idea that maybe one day they want to be a brewer, and those are the sorts of things to start thinking about and start implementing into your practices to kind of get you used to
that way of thinking.
think
that
so.
way
When
of
you're
operating.
brewing on something 20 times this size,
Yeah. And money at stake, lots of money. You don't want to be ruining batches of beer.
no. Although honestly, if you're thinking about being a brewer, go and do a plumber's apprenticeship.
Yeah.
Because a really good home brewer is probably not quite as employable to a brewery as somebody who can fix the valves and the pipes when they invariably stuff up. Just gonna switch that element off. So I'm not in a rush here. It's only at about 80 something degrees. I'm just continually pouring a little bit of water.
Just watching that volume rise. So in the middle of the Braumeister, there's a tie rod with markings on it, so you can tell the volume, how much liquid is in there.
And it's just gradually dripping through.
Just getting it in a bit more.
And gradually dripping through is good because it'll pick up more sugar as it gradually drips through.
So this is basically a Sparge step for anyone who is new to brewing. Every system sort of has its own kind of different way of doing it, but sparging is basically rinsing the grains with a bit of extra water just to extract that little bit of sugar. You don't have to sparge. It's not
particularly
necessary.
on a Braumeister. You could absolutely just, which is why it doesn't come with a trivet. The reason why I use a trivet is it makes it easier to sparge because you can see that mark on the tie rod a little bit easier. But you can absolutely just lift it up, let it drain off until it stops draining, pull it out, and then just top it up to the 25 litres for the boil with water.
Do that,
There's nothing wrong with that. It's a really efficient brewing system, the way that it circulates water through the grains. So you're not really going to be missing out on too much sugar from your grains. But these trivets are like, what, $10? They're not much. And if you're going to be adding water in there, you may as well add it in through the grains.
You might as well, exactly. I mean, the other option is just to start with a higher volume of water at the beginning, basically doing a full volume mash, as demonstrated in Ben's Brew in a Bag video, which is very popular at the moment. Yeah, that was a full volume mash, basically without a sparge step. But for anyone who is a brew in a bagger, this method is exactly the same as what you would do for brew in a bag. You just lift the bag out, and instead of, as Ben's doing here with the malt pipe, you just sort of put water through the bag. Just try and sort of rinse it through the bag as it's.
You can even get a bucket of hot water and dunk it in like a tea bag.
Or do it that way, exactly, yeah.
Or put a massive hose in one end of the bag across the room and spray it into the kettle.
That too.
Do all sorts of things.
Yeah. Hello. We've got a beer delivery.
Is it busy in there? Nice. It's a busy day in the shop apparently, guys. So thanks for giving me a reason to be out here brewing beer. It's been such a busy week this week.
Everything's opening up.
Stress levels have been high, trying to stay on top of everything. So it's a nice way to round out the week, I think, with a brewing demo. Kind of gently ease into the weekend.
And that was Matt before. We was off screen. Just delivered a beer. I don't know the story behind this one, but
neither do I. But while we're waiting on this to come up to the boil, get a little. Ooh.
It's got a nice rocky.
Saison or something?
Really, is it? I don't know. Yeah, he didn't say what it was.
Smells like a saison. or something Belgian.
Excuse us while we
Yeah, it's
drink on
definitely a saison.
Yeah, drink on camera. Yeah,
Oh, it's really nice.
Peppery.
Very peppery. Got a nice bitterness to it as well. I think a lot of saisons kind of a bit too conservative with the hops.
Yeah, I really like a hoppy saison. I mean, it's not traditional, but
Well, it is traditional.
oh well, sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm not American.
That's another. That's a
New
stream
World
for
hop,
another
so-
day.
Yeah,
talking
that's
about-
another. Yeah.
But it generally would have been brewed around hop harvest time, so they would have thrown heaps of hops in there.
Cheers.
Cheers, biggies.
It's good, isn't it?
Yeah.
Whose beer is this, Oscar?
Matt's Golden Strong.
Ah, it's Golden Strong. There we go.
1388.
okay.
Which is, I think just pills and dextrose.
Okay, so we were wrong. It wasn't a saison.
Yeah, there was something else going on in there, wasn't there? There was a Belgian beer.
It's all the fucking same.
All Belgian beers are the same, says Oscar.
Send your hate mail care of
Yeah,
Oscar at Grand Great. Yeah, so Duval, Belgian Strong.
Yes.
That's the one of the commercial, widely available commercial examples.
Well, I take back my praise now that I know that it's Matt's. It's far too bitter. Honestly, that's really nice.
Yep.
So Matt has spent quite a long time dialing in his saisons and his farmhouse ales and his triples and golden strongs and things like that. So he speaking about learning how to brew styles. This is probably iteration number 20. I'm guessing. Dude definitely puts in the work.
And actually, you know what I am getting from this? I'm getting that Pilsner sweetness
Yeah.
coming through from the malt, which is, it's hard to describe, but once you sort of get, again, when we talk about flavours and once your head brain makes that connection,
It's-
it's or you get once you notice it.
It's the only ingredient that you can use as a descriptor in BJCP judging,
Oh, really?
like in your exams. So like, usually if you say like, oh, you use too much like Golding's hops or something, they say, no, you can't say that because you don't know if they've used Golding's hops or whatever, like you're just assuming. But Pilsen, like Pilsner malt has such a unique flavour and you can't really describe it as anything other than Pilsner malt. Like it just is a Pilsner malt flavour. So they're like, that's a valid descriptor in judging. So if you ever enter your beers in for a competition for judging and you use Pilsner malt, you may get Pilsner malt as a description in your write-up.
It just shows that cuts through the Belgian yeast character even.
Which is
I mean, I'm
impressive.
sure the Belgian yeast is probably bringing it out more as well. But yeah, it's just nice.
It really is. So the 1388 is the Roquefort yeast, I think.
Okay.
Oh, maybe not. It might be Chimay.
Yeah, I've gotten the
Chimay's 1214.
exact strain.
Bear with me one second.
Yeah, we have a chart in the attached to the core room there.
It's the Duval.
Oh, it is. Okay,
Duval,
it is the
yeah.
Duval strain. Okay.
So it's appropriate.
Yeah.
Really. I'm nearly completely dripped up to the 25 litres. So I think I'd put the exact amount of water I needed in.
Hit your mark.
If you don't have to go that slow, I just thought there's no reason not to. But you just dump a heap of water in there if you want to, and then once it hits the mark, just move the malt pipe off and let it drain off elsewhere. But, you know.
Yeah.
It looks like it's getting close, 91.5 degrees in there, so nearly hit the boil. What I'll do is, we don't have the backdrop up today because we've got the urn for
Yeah.
sparging, but I'll unplug the urn so that I've turned it off. I've turned the switch off and I've unplugged it, so there's no risk of me leaving the urn on with a little bit of water in the bottom over the weekend and having it burn dry and cook the element.
Yeah.
Which is a good tip.
And worse, leading to...
Don't give yourself the opportunity to wreck your stuff. But yeah. We've pretty much, I think...
So yeah, what do you think?
I don't think there's much more to cover on Vienna Lager, really. Like, it's...
Covered the basics.
One thing I will say is the hopping. There's a few different approaches to the hopping. Some people will just do a single bittering edition. Some people will do a later edition as well. I traditionally have done a 10 to 15 minute edition. Okay. My Vienna lagers, but I'm not doing that today.
Okay.
The last couple of beers like this I've done, I kind of felt like there was too much hop flavour.
Right.
Which a little bit is okay, but you really want to limit it. So I thought, well, I'll just do the bittering edition today, which is pretty traditional. And sometimes if you're brewing a style and like the kind of traditional, like the description of the style is like low to none, you're better off with none than slightly more than low.
Yep.
And that's kind of what I'm shooting for here. Hop flavour is not the same as bitterness. It's like it's like Tettnang, for example, has a real kind of twangy floral sort of flavour to it. And that's what I've noticed in the beer that I brewed recently. The lager that I brewed with it was too much of that. So yeah, I'm just gonna do a dose of Hallertau, and you still do get character from the hops that you put in at the start of the boil. A lot of people will say,
yes, yeah,
you boil hops for an hour, you don't get any of the character, but you absolutely do.
Yep, I agree. People, definitely still get some flavour and aroma carry through from a boil addition.
So I'm shooting for, like I said before, bitterness to gravity ratio of 0.5. So I think, what bitterness did I actually dial in?
On your recipe?
Checking my recipe. 25 RBUs.
Right. Which happens to be...
Which makes sense because it's a 1050 beer. I should have just thought of that, but 25 RBUs for a 1050 beer. Which is a little higher than a lot of the German, particularly the Bavarian. So like if you're used to Bavarian beers are a lot sweeter and a lot more balanced towards the malt. If you think of like a Hefeweizen, you're under 15 IBUs. Märzen usually would be 15 to 20. The exception would be Pilsner, but Pilsner is an exception in and of itself.
Right.
Pilsner is kind of like the original hoppy beer. But your German Pilsners are usually around the 40 to 50 mark.
Yes, they're quite chunky.
And they're quite sharp.
Yep.
So like a Czech Pils has got the softness to it.
Yep.
Whereas the German Pilsners are like hops.
Yeah, sharp. And it's the bitterness as well as flavour, but mostly it's the bitterness you notice.
But Bavarian Pilsners slightly different. Again, Bavarian beers tend to be sweeter than the rest of even Germany. So you do get less of that really sort of sharp firmness that you get from like Pilsners from elsewhere in Germany, but it is still up there in the IBUs. So that would be the exception for Bavarian beers. But most Bavarian beers are down pretty low in terms of the bitterness.
And Munich, Helles, is that part of Bavaria? That's southern Germany, is that right?
Yep, so Munich is the capital of Bavaria. So yeah, your Helles, again, it's a bit different.
Yeah, again, that's a different again. Yeah.
For the record, I don't think all Belgian beers are the same.
Oscar is just
backtracking.
Hey, come on.
We'll edit that out.
So Oscar is retracting his statement.
We're already making
all Belgian beers are the same.
Our sniping video. What are those political campaign videos that just like attack the other?
Yeah, Belgian beers Sad.
Oscar thinks that all Belgian beers are the same. Is this the person you want teaching you about beer? In all fairness, Oscar does know a lot about beer.
He does. We're
He's very knowledgeable.
all right. Well, so from here, yeah, just the usual. It'll be doing the boil, adding your hops as per the recipe, and then cubing the beer. Most of our streams kind of usually wrap up. Yeah, once
Around
we've
that point?
gone. Yeah, wrap it.
There's only
before
so many times you can show a boil.
Yeah. We have
it's-
videos on that. Particularly our 500 litre Braumeister video, which is probably one of the oldest ones on the channel, that is constantly getting comments about how crap the boil is on it. It was I think they had the
Oh, right up to the
it
top.
was right up to the top.
Yeah, we used to do that all the time.
It was a special one-off boil, but also just in general, I think the contentious issue that people have, this idea that a boil needs to be vigorous and you need a crazy boil in order for it to.
Let's address it now on the record, on the YouTube.
Let's do it.
Let's attack this.
I know we've brought it up, but
Slanderous. No, look, I think for a long time the kind of, I should probably put my mask back up now that I'm not drinking a beer. Although Melbourne,
we
0 cases over a month.
Yeah, we're
Killing it.
Are we a month now?
Over a month.
Over a month.
Yeah.
So,
The other day was 28 days, so we're past that now.
Good for us.
It was hard work, but we, did what had to be done, and it worked. We were on par with London at the height of our sort of cases, like 700 cases a day. It was the same in London at the same time. We got down to 0, and they're not doing so good at the moment, sadly.
Unfortunately, in other parts of the world, really struggling still. So,
but
we hope you're all doing well.
Hopefully, people can sort of look at what we did and try to apply some of the lessons. Like lockdown works, masks work.
You'll notice we're still wearing our masks, even though it's probably
a month
fairly
with no
safe not
cases,
to,
but it's not worth risking.
We're also wearing a mask here, but. Yes, the contentious issue of the boil. Our Braumeister, our 500 litre Braumeister, apparently has a crap boil, if you believe the comments. And how dare it? So what do we say to that?
So, I mean, there's a few things to say. One of them you kind of touched on, and we will kind of go into that in a little bit more detail, but the 500 litre Braumeisters are built and designed to brew 500 litres of wort. The elements are designed to heat and boil 500 litres of wort. In that video, we've got roughly 900 litres of wort in there. So we're really pushing the elements to their limit in terms of what they're able to achieve. So it's not going to be as vigorous a boil when you've got nearly double the amount of liquid that the thing's designed to bring to the boil.
Yeah,
that's probably the main thing worth mentioning in regards to that. The other thing, which I think you were hinting at before and is really worth touching on, is what is a rolling boil and how vigorous a boil is needed in order to drive off all the things we need to drive off over the course of our hour boil. Not much.
Not as much as you might think.
If you're at 100 degrees, you are volatilizing off DMS and assorted other things that you want to volatilize off, whether there's movement or not. Movement will obviously help to facilitate that process, but there's a point at which there are negative consequences as well.
Yep.
So did you want to?
No, well, I was just, I guess the, and you probably may be able to explain it better than me, but a vigorous boil, to a vigorous boil can actually cause a hot side aeration effect.
So that is one thing.
One thing.
And hot side aeration is one of those really contentious issues.
Which is in itself, in and of itself, a very contentious
Some
issue.
people swear it's a big deal. Some people swear it's absolutely meaningless and not worth thinking about. But yeah, absolutely. If it is a thing that has a negative impact on beer, then having your boil leaping out of the kettle is absolutely going to encourage it.
Something about the oxygen molecules that are in there, even though a boiling liquid is free of oxygen, but there's, and again, not a chemist, not a scientist, I'm going to say the same disclaimer that Ben frequently uses, but something happens that the molecules bind in a certain way that causes the oxygen to get trapped in there, in the boil, and that's about the limit of my ability to explain it.
But hot side aeration, I think, is the least consequential. Sorry about the noise. I think the least consequential of the potential downsides to having too extreme a boil.
All right. I'll let you finish.
Yeah, sorry, I'm making noise while I'm doing this.
But
just because I need to pull this and put it into the bucket so that I can access that and break up the skin forming so that I don't get a boiler. You know, all those things that happen when you're brewing. Look at that. No drips. Perfect. So there was a study done about 4 or 5 years ago, I think, looking at the impact of thermal load on stability of beer and of the presence of various different types of spoilage, precursors and spoilage flavors and aromas. And it was found that the higher the thermal load built into a beer, the more prone it was to specifically oxidation
Thank
issues.
you. That's a better way of describing it that I could.
So basically, the more heat you're blasting at your wort, the more thermal load you're imparting into the wort. And that is going to carry that with it, and it's going to get oxidized and stale a lot faster. It's going to present different off flavors a lot faster. You're going to impact the stability of your beer. You're going to have a negative impact the higher the thermal load is on the beer. And that doesn't just stop at your boil. Like that goes into the malting process as well. Like a big thing that a lot of people talk about is like medium crystal, so like 60 Lovibond, 120 EBC crystal malt. Used to be really popular, but people stopped using it. Not completely, but like they started looking for different crystal malt colors to use because for some reason that 60 Love, 120 EBC crystal malt tended to present with stale, oxidized, or even like diacetyl type flavors in the beer. And part of the reason why they now think that could be is the heat imparted on the malt through the malting process and through the kilning process and all those different things that happen is contributing to the overall thermal load of the wort and making those kinds of spoilage characteristics.
Right. So sort of locking something in there in that process that's contributing to premature staling of the beer.
Yeah. Sorry, I just saw that I hit the boil.
That's all right. You got stuff to do.
It goes further.
It goes further.
I was hitting a rolling boil.
Yeah, yeah.
So I thought I'd throw the hops in and just fix up the. So basically, this is an older version of the Brewmaster. There's a new update now that makes so I don't have to do that anymore. But with the older versions, what I would tend to do is set the boil temperature to 103 so that the element never flicks off. And then once I can see it's boiling, change it down to 100 to kick off the timer for the boil, and then bump it back up to 103 to keep the elements going. You don't need to do that with the new updates. We just haven't updated this one in a really long time. There's a new feature that is in there that makes it so that the element doesn't kick off through the boil. Back to thermal load. So, yeah, if you're just absolutely blasting your kettle with heat, and you're boiling so vigorously that the wort's leaping up out of the kettle, and potentially hot side aerating if that is a thing, but definitely putting way more BTUs into there than are needed to boil. A big example of that is if you've got a big jet gas burner underneath your kettle, blasting tons and tons of heat in there. All that latent energy, all that latent heat that's going into the wort is unnecessary. Like, it's not needed to boil. You need to get it to 100 degrees, and then there's a little bit of latent energy to take it from that 100 degrees into the boiling point, so that you start
breaking surface tension and seeing it doing bubbles.
But it's not as much as a lot of people blast into their wort.
Yeah.
So it is worth, I think, revisiting that idea of what a rolling boil is, and I think, I don't know if you can see in here, but this to me is like the perfect boil. Like,
I'll get some cutaway footage, perhaps. I'll splice it in later.
There's movement, and like the word rolling is really appropriate. It's like it's rolling across the surface of the liquid. It's not jumping, it's not bubbling, it's not going crazy, but there's movement, and it's rolling across.
I have seen advice.
And just that little bit of movement, that little bit of sort of rolling is exactly what you want. Like just enough to, like, it's boiling, it's there, but it's not exploding. Like, it's not.
It's not. And I think perhaps that there used to be a lot of advice floating around there, especially on the internets, that you had to. Maybe people interpreted the word rolling wrong, or vigorous boil, I think is what I would often hear in podcasts and read, and perhaps people interpret that as it needs to be just a volcanoing out of the
trying to escape.
It's just not necessary, and just hard to achieve, especially on a overloaded Braumeister. When you've got a gentle boil, which again is perfectly adequate and does the job perfectly fine. It's not.
And I think the fact that we were able to get that movement in like double the amount of wort that the thing's rated to, or the thing's designed to cook is it. Oh, it's a kid behind me,
and that's
a testament to the unit.
Yes, and we've since upgraded. Now we have a 1,000-litre unit. We still have the 500.
We've got two 500s, So
is it just two 500s? So do we have a 1,000?
We have a 1,000-litre unit that we bought in from Germany. We just sold it to Copperhead Brewery up in Noosa, or Cooroy, which is near Noosa. I actually went there at the start of this year, and if any of you guys are in Queensland, definitely go. The food was incredible, and the beers are all amazing. And Davey, the brewer up there, is pretty much knocking out beers to cover their 2 pubs / restaurants they own up there. So they've got a place on like the main strip of Noosa. I can't remember what the street's called, like the main one.
Okay, I'm not familiar.
Along the beach.
Too familiar with that part of the world.
They've got like a Asian-themed restaurant with Asian-themed beers, like
cool.
specific beers for that particular location. And then they've got the Copperhead out in Cooroy, which is like more their pub dining sort of thing. And both places, the food was out of this world, and the beers incredible and specific to their menus.
Yep.
He's knocking it all out on a 200-litre Braumeister.
Yeah. And
two different venues, I think there was like 6 taps in each venue, and he's knocking them all out on a 200. I'm like, he must be doing like 3 brews a day, 7 days a week.
I'm sure the boil isn't isn't
So they've upgraded to the 1,000,
massively vigorous
which
either.
I think Davey will be very, very happy
Cool.
to be brewing on a 1,000 litre now and getting 5 times the amount of output in one brew day.
Yeah.
Because they need it.
Yeah.
But the beers are so good that, yeah, good on them. If you're in Queensland, definitely go. And I was blown away actually. Like Noosa has an amazing food scene that I wasn't expecting.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
I think
Not
like, I
been
used to
there for years.
go on holidays to Queensland a lot as a kid, and like my memories are always of like Sizzlers in Toowoomba.
Yes, sure.
And
Yeah.
for some reason in my brain, I just thought, oh yeah, Queensland, like Sizzlers.
Sizzler.
But yeah, the food up there was awesome, but particularly at Cophead. So yeah, check them out.
Yeah. But here, okay, so we just got the two 500s.
This is on a spruiking stream.
Yes, I know.
This week I was
We've
spruiking
been
Pitbull guitars and spruiking
doing a
Cophead
few
Brewery.
shout outs today.
All the big shout outs, but
But there you go. What do you think? The rolling boil. Yeah, I'll edit this.
so no
into it.
shade, no shade on anyone who's making the comments because
Yeah,
they're making
that's-
them out of a good place. I think. I hope.
If people agree, disagree, that's what the comment section is
get
for.
get into it in the comments.
Let us know what you think.
But
Yeah.
definitely look into. So I don't know if you guys watch the Brewing Network, but listen to the Brewing Network. But John and Jamil did an episode of Brew Strong specifically relating to thermal load.
Okay.
That was when I first learned about it. Because the study is pretty heavy.
Right.
If you're not a chemist,
Yeah.
you probably won't fully appreciate like what they're talking about. But John and Jamil are nerds, and they break it down into dumb person terms so that people like me can understand.
Actually, put them on the same show. I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So definitely, it would have been about 4 or 5 years ago.
4 or
so
5
look
years
through
ago. Okay, so
if you go onto the Brewing Network and just search thermal load, you'll probably
Thermal
come up with
load.
that episode. And it was a really interesting listen.
I will try to find a link to that. I'll try to find a link to the article. So maybe there's always opportunity to learn something new and change your past knowledge. There's on what you maybe thought was once a fact or the truth about brewing.
And that's
study
not
comes
to say
along.
that you need to change your practices necessarily.
No.
If your beers are coming out really good and you're
Exactly. That's
every time you brew, you're making sure that you get a little bit of wort on the roof. Then
if
don't
the
change
beers are
it.
coming out awesome, I mean, it
Don't change.
speaks for itself, doesn't it?
Because that's going to impact it. Like it is absolutely going to impact it. Like the extra heat is probably going to caramelize more
Yes, you're
sugars
gonna-
in your wort.
exactly, you're gonna get
more
the colour change.
more flavour. Like so, if that's what you're chasing, then do it.
Yep. But interesting. It was an interesting note of contention, nonetheless. We know that we've certainly been knocking out perfectly adequate beers, wet kits in our, and that one, that beer in particular in that video, it's a Dog Colt. It was their special. It was the red.
Oh
ale.
yeah, the Brewdog collaboration. thing.
Brewdog, sorry, yeah, collaboration that we did, yeah, with it was a sour.
That was
I think.
good.
Yeah.
With the balsamic
With the
vinegar?
balsamic vinegar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Blueberry sour with balsamic vinegar, guys.
Yeah.
Which was crazy. Sorry, it wasn't even a blueberry sour. It was just a blueberry beer with balsamic vinegar, and the
We had a
beer
kit?
on its own, because we had it on tap in the shop, and the beer on its own was just kind of As soon as you put the vinegar in there, like the blueberries just exploded out of it, because I think blueberry is such a subtle flavour. It needed the acidity and the kind of the oaky complexity of the balsamic vinegar to elevate it. And as soon as it was in there, it was just.
That's right. We had those bags. There were bags of blueberries in there too.
Yeah.
That would have been messing with the boil as well, and all kinds of stuff. I remember that day.
Well, yeah, I mean,
But,
Hendo. It was Hendo.
Yeah, and it was Hendo. We were talking about him earlier.
We
So
talked about him
crazy
earlier.
beer.
And his brother, I think, made the vinegar.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So that was a fun day. And it's probably our highest viewed video as well.
Interesting.
Most viewed video, and apparently most hated. So awesome.
I mean, controversy is good, right?
Yeah, exactly.
As long as we're not getting too many downvotes on it.
I don't think so. I
I think brewers are good people. Good people don't
generally
downvote.
good people. I mean, it's just some of the
unless
comments.
it's like a really horrible video, like or a really polarizing video saying like things which one group of people doesn't agree with.
We're not trolling anyone in that.
But, like a video like that, people
Brewers.
who downvote videos like that are not good people.
Yeah. And brewers have opinions just like everyone else.
Yeah.
And so share yours below, but yeah, just something interesting to note, I think, about boils, and maybe something to learn for us all.
Hopefully.
Yeah. So what do you think?
Yeah, I reckon
do you think we've covered it?
Yeah, it's
Yeah. Cool. All right.
went longer than I was expecting.
Yeah,
actually,
I guess we were talking crap a bit today. So
good thing about having two of us is we keep the conversation going.
Yeah, true. I hope everyone watching has enjoyed it so far. We've rambled a bit, but and drank beer in front of you. I hope if you were drinking along,
you probably got more
enjoying
access to beer at home than what you would at work usually.
Yeah, yeah. And at the moment, home brewers are probably got more stock than access to everyone else. So yeah, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoy it. Keep an eye on the channel. When we eventually start uploading more content later on, we'll be notifying everyone of that in the newsletters and the usual avenues, subscribe, all that stuff. And the next demo, I believe, will be with Helen in a couple of weeks. So that should be fun. I think it's brewing a mystery beer. We'll find out what that is coming up. So yeah, all right. Thanks again.
Take it easy. Stay safe.
See ya.